Before we begin tonight's investigation, if you're enjoying this content, please consider using your hype points on this video. It helps the channel more than you could possibly know, and it allows us to keep bringing you these deep dives into the unexplained. Also, if you'd like, drop a comment letting us know what time it is where you are and where in the world you're listening from. We absolutely love seeing where everyone is tuning in from around the globe, and a special thanks to Justin for suggesting this story. Now, let's get into it. Intro. The Discovery. December 2020. National Archives, College Park, Maryland. The fluorescent lights hummed their familiar drone as Laura Benton wheeled another cart of Cold War materials into the processing room. After 16 years as an archivist, she'd developed a rhythm: log the box number, check the inventory list, remove each item, photograph, digitize, refile, repeat. She'd processed thousands of documents this way: missile telemetry data, reconnaissance photographs, strategic planning memos, the bureaucratic detritus of the nuclear age, now declassified and catalogued for researchers who would probably never look at most of it. Box CW-4789L contained film reels from Johnston Atoll, the remote Pacific island that had served as a launch site for high-altitude nuclear tests in the early 1960s. Laura had processed dozens of similar boxes: launch footage, tracking data, atmospheric readings, nothing unusual. She pulled out the third canister and noticed the label was handwritten rather than typed. That was odd, but not unprecedented. Field personnel often labelled reels on site before sending them back to archives. The label read, USF Tracking Reel, Johnston Island, July 1962. Do not duplicate. Laura made a note of the restriction. Probably contained classified camera angles or revealed equipment specifications that were still sensitive even after all these years. She'd seen similar warnings before. She set up the projector, threaded the film with practiced hands and dimmed the lights. The screen flickered to life. The footage was grainy, black and white, shot from what appeared to be a ground-based camera tracking the sky. Time code ran along the bottom edge. July 9th, 1962. 0900 hours, Zulu time. Starfish Prime. The most powerful nuclear weapon ever detonated in space. 1.4 megatons at an altitude of 250 miles above the Pacific Ocean. Laura had seen footage of Starfish Prime before. It was one of the most documented nuclear tests in history. The detonation had knocked out streetlights in Hawaii, disrupted radio communications across the Pacific, and created artificial auroras visible from Hawaii to New Zealand. The countdown proceeded in silence. Film reels from this era rarely included audio. She watched the sky, waiting for the flash. And then it came. The screen went white. The nuclear fireball expanded. A perfect sphere of light against the darkness of space. The camera's exposure struggled to compensate, creating that familiar bloom effect around the detonation point. Laura had watched this sequence dozens of times in other footage. She knew what came next. The fireball would fade, the camera would readjust, the sky would return to black. But in that half second before the exposure corrected, she saw something else. A shape. A curve, an arc. She stopped the projector, rewound 10 frames, advanced slowly, frame by frame. There. The nuclear flash had illuminated something above the detonation point. Something massive. Something that shouldn't have been there. It wasn't clouds. The curvature was too regular, too precise. It wasn't aurora. The edges were too defined. It wasn't an artifact of the film. The shape remained consistent across multiple frames, with three-dimensional depth and shadow. It was a structure. Laura felt her pulse quicken. She advanced the film frame by frame, studying the shape. It appeared to be an arc, like a section of an enormous dome, positioned above the Earth's atmosphere. The nuclear flash had backlit it for just a fraction of a second, long enough for the camera to capture its outline against the void of space. She checked the time code again. This footage was taken from Johnston Island, which meant the camera was looking northwest toward the detonation point. The structure appeared to be between the camera and the blast, which meant it was somewhere in the upper atmosphere or low orbit. But that was impossible. There were no structures in orbit in 1962. The first American satellite had launched just 4 years earlier. The International Space Station wouldn't exist for another 4 decades. In July of '62, humanity had barely managed to put a man in orbit. So what was this? Laura rewound the film and played it again. The structure was still there, solid, unmoving, massive enough to be visible from hundreds of miles away. She needed to document this. She switched on the digitization equipment and began capturing the frames. The old projector clacked and whirred as the film advanced through the scanner. Each frame converted to a digital file stored on the archive's internal network. She was halfway through the scan when the door opened. Laura looked up. 2 men stood in the doorway, dark suits, no ties. One was older, grey-haired, with the kind of weathered face that suggested a career spent outdoors. The other was younger, maybe mid-30s, with the alert posture of someone trained to move quickly. Neither of them wore identification badges. "Miss Benton," the older man said. Not a question, a statement. He knew her name. "Can I help you?" Laura asked, her hand instinctively moving toward the phone on her desk. The younger man moved to the projector with practiced efficiency. He didn't ask permission. He simply unplugged the power, cord, and began removing the film reel. "Hey, wait," Laura said, standing. "That's archive property. You can't just—" "You're done for the day, Miss Benton," the older man said. His voice was calm, almost gentle, but it carried absolute authority. "Please gather your personal items and come with us." "I don't understand. Who are you?" "We're escorting you out. That's all you need to know." The younger man had already secured the film reel in a metal case he'd brought with him. He unplugged her computer workstation without shutting it down. The screen went black mid-scan. "I need to log this properly," Laura protested. "There are procedures." "The procedures have changed," the older man said. "Come with us. Now." Something in his tone made it clear this wasn't a request. Laura grabbed her purse, her mind racing. She hadn't done anything wrong. This was declassified material. She was following standard archival protocols, but these men didn't seem to care about protocols. They walked her through the archive building in silence. Other staff members glanced up from their work, then quickly looked away. The older man held her arm gently but firmly, the kind of grip that communicated control without causing pain. They escorted her to the parking lot. Her car sat in its usual spot, illuminated by the late afternoon sun. The older man released her arm. "Go home, Miss Benton," he said. "Forget what you saw. Consider it classified retroactively." "I don't—" "Go home." Laura got in her car. Her hands were shaking. She sat there for 20 minutes, watching the archive building in her rearview mirror, trying to process what had just happened. She'd been processing declassified materials, public record. Anyone with a researcher card could request access to those files. So why had 2 men in suits just confiscated a film reel that was supposed to be open to the public? And more importantly, what was that structure in the footage? That night, sitting at her home computer, Laura went through her archive access logs. The digitization had been interrupted, but the first few frames had already uploaded to the network before the men arrived. She found one frame, just one, the clearest shot of the structure, captured at the exact moment when the nuclear flash provided maximum illumination. She saved it to a USB drive. Then she deleted it from the network. Laura knew aerospace historians. She'd worked with dozens of them over the years, helping them navigate the archive's classified materials. One name came to mind: Evan Mercer. He'd written extensively about Cold War programs and had a reputation for taking strange leads seriously. She composed an email, short, simple, attached the image. "Do you know what this could be?" She hit send. 2 days later, Laura Benton's phone went straight to voicemail. Her apartment stood empty, the door locked, her car still parked in its assigned space. The National Archives received her resignation, letter via email, effective immediately, with no forwarding address. Her supervisor tried calling her emergency contacts. Her parents hadn't heard from her. Her sister didn't know where she'd gone. Nobody at the archive knew anything except that 2 men in suits had escorted her out on Tuesday afternoon. The film reel from box CW-4789L was logged as lost in processing. Equipment failure, a common occurrence with old reels, nothing suspicious. But in Ohio, Evan Mercer opened an email from an archivist he'd worked with 3 years ago on a book about spy satellites. He clicked the attachment and stared at the image on his screen. A nuclear detonation, a flash, and behind it, illuminated for just a fraction of a second, something that shouldn't exist. Evan zoomed in on the image, studying the curve of the structure, the way the light fell on its surface, the shadows that suggested depth and dimension. Then he picked up his phone and started making calls. He didn't know it yet, but he'd just inherited the most dangerous investigation of his career, and somewhere in Maryland, Laura Benton's empty apartment was being thoroughly cleaned by people who didn't exist in any government database. Chapter 1. The Impossible Tests. Evan Mercer's office occupied the second floor of a converted warehouse in Columbus, Ohio. 3 rooms filled with filing cabinets, reference books, and boxes of declassified documents he'd accumulated over 15 years of research. His specialty was Cold War aerospace programs, the classified projects that pushed the boundaries of what humanity thought possible during the nuclear age. He'd written 3 books, the first on the Corona Spy satellite program, the second on early missile defense concepts, the third on Project West Ford, an attempt to create an artificial radiation belt using millions of copper needles in orbit. All of them based on painstaking research through declassified archives, FOIA requests, and interviews with retired military and scientific personnel. The image Laura Benton had sent him didn't fit anything he'd researched before. He printed it out, pinned it to his wall, stared at it for an hour. Then he went to his filing cabinets and pulled every folder related to high-altitude nuclear testing. Operation Fishbowl. He knew the basic history. Part of the larger Operation Dominic series in 1962, Fishbowl had conducted multiple nuclear detonations in the upper atmosphere and low orbit. The stated purpose was to study EMP effects and radiation belt responses. The test had created spectacular visual displays, but had also disrupted satellite operations and radio communications across the Pacific. Evans spread out the official test data on his desk. Launch dates, yield specifications, detonation altitudes, camera locations, all meticulously documented in the declassified reports. But he'd learned over the years that what wasn't in the reports often mattered, more than what was. He started with Operation Argus, August through September 1958. 4 years before Fishbowl, 3 nuclear detonations in the Van Allen radiation belts, conducted from Navy ships in the South Atlantic. Argus had remained classified for 24 years. The public didn't learn about it until 1982, when the government finally declassified the mission. That unusually long classification period had always interested Evan. Most nuclear tests were declassified within a decade. Argus stayed secret for nearly a quarter-century. He'd obtained the Argus technical reports years ago for his Project Westford book. He pulled them out now and read them with fresh eyes. The language was peculiar. Evaluate radiative responses in artificial belt structures. Mapping of containment boundaries at high altitude. Measurement of artificial barrier fluctuations under nuclear loading. Evans circled those phrases. Containment boundaries, artificial barrier, nuclear loading. He'd read hundreds of nuclear test reports. This terminology was unique to Argus. Other tests talked about yield measurements, fallout patterns, atmospheric effects. They used standard nuclear weapons terminology, but Argus used the language of testing barriers, of measuring responses, of evaluating containment. as if they weren't testing weapons at all, as if they were testing something else. Evan made notes and moved on to Fishbowl. Operation Dominic, the umbrella program, conducted 43 nuclear tests throughout 1962. Fishbowl represented the high-altitude subset, the tests with exotic names: Bluegill Prime, Starfish Prime, Checkmate, Kingfish, Tightrope, detonations at altitudes ranging from 12 miles to over 200 miles. The official outcomes were well documented. Starfish Prime, the largest test, had been visible from Hawaii to New Zealand. The artificial auroras persisted for several minutes. The EMP knocked out streetlights in Honolulu, 900 miles from the detonation point. Radio communications across the Pacific were disrupted for hours. All expected effects from a 1.4 megaton detonation at high altitude. But Evan found anomalies in the technical appendices. An Air Force tracking station report mentioned unexpected shockwave reflections detected by multiple radar installations. A Navy camera operations log noted persistent equipment anomalies requiring calibration review after Bluegill Prime. A Los Alamos radiation measurement summary referenced secondary energy returns inconsistent with atmospheric models. These weren't headline findings. They were buried in footnotes and appendices, the kind of technical minutiae that most researchers skipped over. But Evan had learned to pay attention to footnotes. That's where the interesting questions lived. He cross-referenced the radar reports. 3 separate installations had detected the anomalous reflections. All at approximately the same altitude, right around 200 miles above Earth's surface, the same altitude where Laura's photograph showed the structure. Evan pulled the personnel files next. Fishbowl had involved dozens of scientists and military officers, but 2 names appeared repeatedly in the documentation. John Wolfe, radiation belt specialist, Princeton graduate. He'd published extensively on Van Allen belt physics before Fishbowl, then abruptly shifted his research focus afterward. No more papers on radiation belts. Instead, he'd moved into general plasma physics, never directly addressing high-altitude phenomena again. John Craven, Navy officer, project officer for Argus, technical advisor for Fishbowl, career military man with top-level security clearances. After Fishbowl, he'd moved to classified submarine programs and never spoke publicly about the nuclear tests. Both men had left behind personal notes in their archived papers. Evan had obtained copies years ago. He read them again now. Wolfe's notes from June 1962, just before Bluegill Prime. Preliminary models suggest behaviour inconsistent with known magnetospheric responses. Need higher altitude detonation for confirmation. Craven's notes from July, right after Starfish Prime. Results exceed expectations. Further testing may be inadvisable. Recommend consultation with theoretical physics group. Inadvisable. That word stuck with Evan. Nuclear tests were massive government operations involving thousands of personnel and millions of dollars. You didn't call them inadvisable unless something had gone seriously wrong, or seriously unexpected. Evan looked at the test schedule. Fishbowl had been planned to continue through November. Multiple additional tests at various altitudes. But after Starfish Prime in July, the testing pace changed. Delays, equipment failures, modified flight plans. Bluegill Prime in June had failed, the missile detonating early at around 30 miles altitude. Bluegill Double Prime in July had failed, exploding on the launch pad. Starfish Prime succeeded in July, detonating at 250 miles. Bluegill Triple Prime in October succeeded at 30 miles. Checkmate in October failed, detonating early. Kingfish in November succeeded at 60 miles. The pattern was revealing. The only high-altitude test that worked was Starfish Prime. Everything after that stayed below 100 miles, and half of those tests failed, as if something was stopping them from going higher. Evan made a timeline on his whiteboard. Argus in 58, 4 years of apparent analysis, then Fishbowl in 62, focusing on even higher altitudes. One successful high-altitude test, then a sudden shift to lower altitudes and multiple failures. He stepped back and looked at the timeline. It looked less like a testing program and more like an escalation followed by a retreat, as if they'd tried something at high altitude and gotten a response they didn't expect. He needed to know what the scientists had been thinking before and after these tests. The official reports would be sanitized. But scientists kept personal correspondence. They shared preliminary findings with colleagues. They wrote conference papers and grant proposals. Evan started with James Van Allen. Van Allen had discovered the radiation belts in 1958 using data from the Explorer satellites. The belts bore his name. He was the world's foremost expert on near-Earth radiation environments. If anyone would understand what was happening during these high-altitude tests, it would be Van Allen. And Van Allen's public statements showed a curious pattern. Before Argus, he'd been vocal about the dangers of nuclear testing in space. He'd written op-eds calling the test reckless experimentation. He'd testified before Congress, warning that we didn't fully understand the radiation belts and shouldn't disturb them with nuclear weapons. Then Argus happened. After Argus, Van Allen went quiet for several months. No more op-eds, no more public warnings. When he finally spoke about high-altitude testing again, his position had shifted. By early 1962, just months before Fishbowl, Van Allen publicly supported the tests. He called them necessary for scientific understanding of near-Earth space environment. This was a complete reversal. Scientists changed their minds based on new evidence, certainly, but Van Allen's shift was abrupt and unexplained. He'd gone from calling the tests reckless to calling them necessary, with no public explanation of what had changed his mind. Evan had obtained Van Allen's archived correspondence from the University of Iowa years ago for background research. He'd skimmed through it then, looking for information about the Explorer satellites. Now he read it more carefully, focusing on the period between Argus and Fishbowl. Most of the letters were routine academic business, conference invitations, peer review requests, graduate student recommendations, but one letter, dated April 1962, stood out. It was addressed to a colleague at Los Alamos. The main body discussed a proposed symposium on space plasma physics, standard stuff. But in the second paragraph, almost as an aside, Van Allen had written, "Our earlier assumptions about the belt's origins may require serious revision. I hesitate to discuss this in writing, but the implications of the Argus data suggest phenomena we hadn't considered. I hope we can discuss this in person at the symposium." Evan read that paragraph 5 times. Earlier assumptions about the belt's origins may require serious revision. Van Allen had discovered the radiation belts. He'd published the definitive papers on their structure and properties. Those belts were named after him. If he was saying the assumptions about their origins needed revision, that meant something fundamental had changed. Something he'd learned from Argus. Something he hesitated to discuss in writing. Evan picked up his phone and called the University of Iowa Physics Department. After several transfers, he reached the archivist responsible for Van Allen's papers. "I'm looking for any additional correspondence from Van Allen in 1962, Evan said, "particularly anything related to high-altitude nuclear testing." "We have the collection you already accessed," the archivist said. "That should include everything from that period." "Are there any restricted materials? Anything that wasn't released?" A pause. "There are some letters that were donated with restrictions. Family request. They won't be available until 2050. "What's in them?" "I can't discuss restricted materials, but I can tell you they're mostly personal correspondence, nothing scientific." "Did Van Allen write anything else about Argus or Fishbowl?" "Not in the unrestricted collection. He gave several talks about the tests, but those were general discussions. No technical details." Evan thanked her and hung up. Van Allen had been careful. Whatever he'd learned from Argus, whatever had made him change his position on high-altitude testing, he'd kept it out of his archived papers, but he'd changed his position for a reason. Evan looked at the photograph on his wall. The structure, the arc, the impossible object that shouldn't exist at 200 miles altitude in 1962. He thought about containment boundaries and artificial barriers, about scientists changing their positions. about tests that succeeded once and then failed repeatedly. And he realised something that made his chest tighten. What if Fishbowl wasn't a weapons test at all? What if it was an attempt to break through something? Chapter 2. The scientists who knew Evan spent the next 2 weeks filing Freedom of Information Act requests. He'd done this hundreds of times for his books and consulting work. The process was tedious but usually productive. Government agencies were required by law to respond, though they often heavily redacted sensitive information. He requested all documents related to high-altitude nuclear testing between 1958 and 1965. Radar tracking data from the Fishbowl tests, camera operation logs, radiation measurement reports, scientific analysis memos, anything that might explain the anomalies he'd found. The responses came back slowly. Most were heavily redacted, large sections blacked out, entire pages sometimes reduced to just the header and footer, everything else classified. But then he got lucky. One document came back completely unredacted, a Los Alamos National Laboratory internal memo that had been declassified in 1998 but never properly catalogued. The FOI processor had found it in a misfiled box and sent it without realising it should have been reviewed for redactions. LA 273 Reflection Event Assessment, July 12th, 1962. Evan stared at the document header, July 12th, 3 days after Starfish Prime. The memo was 3 pages of dense technical language, radar measurements, energy calculations, spectral analysis. Most of it required a physics degree to fully understand, but the conclusion was written in plain English. The returning shockwave was not consistent with interaction with ionosphere or magnetosphere. Energy return suggests reflection from solid or semi-solid boundary at approximately 220 miles altitude. Further analysis terminated by directive. All personnel are to direct future inquiries to Project Officer. Signed by Darrell Froman, Deputy Director of Los Alamos National Laboratory during the 1960s, one of the top administrators in the entire nuclear weapons program. Evan read the conclusion again. Reflection from solid or semi-solid boundary. Not atmospheric effects, not radiation belt interactions, not measurement error, a boundary. Something solid enough to reflect a nuclear shockwave. And analysis had been terminated by directive. Someone had ordered them to stop looking into this. Evan made copies of the memo and stored them in 3 different locations. This was the kind of document that had a tendency to disappear if the wrong people noticed it had been released. Then he started tracking down anyone who'd worked at Los Alamos during the Fishbowl period. Most of the scientists were dead. Nuclear weapons research in the 1960s had involved a lot of radiation exposure, and many of the researchers hadn't lived to old age. The survivors were scattered across the country, mostly in retirement. Evan made dozens of calls. Many people refused to talk. Some claimed they didn't remember anything about Fishbowl. A few hung up as soon as he mentioned high-altitude testing, but one person agreed to talk. On the condition of complete anonymity, Margaret Reeves, 83 years old, living in a retirement community in New Mexico. She'd been Darrell Froman's administrative assistant from 1960 through 1964. She remembered the memo. "That was a strange time," she said when Evan called. Her voice was thin but steady. "A lot of confusion after that big test in July, the one that made the lights go out in Hawaii." "Starfish Prime," Evan said. "That's the one. The data came back and nobody knew what to make of it. I heard the scientists arguing about it in the hallways. They kept saying the numbers didn't make sense." "What numbers?" "The measurements from the tracking stations. They were getting readings that shouldn't have been there, like echoes but from the wrong direction. One scientist said it was like the blast had hit a wall and bounced back." Evan felt his pulse quicken. "Did they figure out what caused it?" A long pause. Evan could hear her breathing on the other end of the line. "Miss Reeves?" "There was a structure," she finally said. Her voice dropped to almost a whisper. "That's why they stopped the tests." "What kind of structure?" "I don't know. I wasn't a scientist." I just heard them talking. They were scared. I'd never seen those men scared before. They'd built the atomic bomb. They'd watched hundreds of weapons tests. But after Starfish Prime, they were scared. Did anyone say what the structure was? No. Mr. Froman called a meeting, closed door. When they came out, he told me to destroy all the analysis documents, everything related to the reflection event. He said it was being classified at a higher level. But you remember the memo? I typed it before the classification order came down. That was the last official analysis they did. After that, everything went quiet. Why did they stop? Another long pause. Miss Reeves, please. Why did they stop the tests? Because they realised they weren't alone, she said quietly. That's what Mr. Froman told me. He said humanity wasn't alone, and we just tried to attack something we didn't understand. He told me to forget everything I'd seen, for my own safety. Did he say who built the structure? No, he wouldn't talk about it after that. None of them would. It was like a wall of silence came down. Even the scientists who'd been arguing in the hallways stopped discussing it. Someone put pressure on them, high-level pressure. Evan had more questions, but Margaret ended the call. She'd said too much already. She knew it. He could hear the fear in her voice. He sat in his office staring at his notes. A structure, reflection signatures, scientists who'd been scared, analysis terminated by directive. This wasn't a measurement error, it wasn't atmospheric anomaly. They detected something real, something solid, something that reflected a nuclear shockwave back to Earth. And someone had ordered them to stop investigating it. Evan pulled up the footage from the other Fishbowl tests. He'd obtained copies of the declassified camera recordings years ago. He'd watched them before, but casually, just getting a sense of what high-altitude nuclear tests looked like. Now he watched them systematically, looking for anomalies. Bluegill Prime, June. The missile had launched successfully but experienced an electrical failure at 30 miles altitude. The warhead detonated early. The official report blamed component malfunction. But Evan noticed something in the telemetry data. The failure occurred at exactly 29.7 miles. The missile systems had been functioning normally up to that point. Then multiple electrical systems failed simultaneously. Not a single component. Multiple systems, all at once, at a specific altitude. Bluegill Double Prime, July. The missile never left the launch pad. Electrical failure during the countdown sequence. The warhead was damaged and had to be recovered. The official report blamed wiring issues, but Evan noticed the countdown had proceeded normally until the moment of ignition. Then the entire missile's electrical system shut down. Not a fuel problem, not a mechanical failure. Electrical systems failure. Same as Bluegill Prime, Starfish Prime, July 9th. Successful launch. Successful detonation at 250 miles. The only completely successful high-altitude test in the entire Fishbowl program. And that was when Laura's photograph showed the structure. After Starfish Prime, the program changed. No more 200-mile altitude tests. Everything dropped to under 100 miles. Bluegill Triple Prime, October. Successful detonation at 30 miles. Checkmate. October. Another electrical failure. Detonation at 60 miles. Well below the planned altitude of 140 miles. Kingfish. November. Successful detonation at 60 miles. But the warhead yield was only half what it should have been. The official report blamed weapons design issues. Evan made a chart. He plotted altitude against test success rate. Below 50 miles, high success rate. 50 to 100 miles, mixed results. Above 100 miles, only one success, followed by multiple failures. The pattern was clear. Something was interfering with the tests at high altitude. Not mechanical problems, not design flaws. Something external, as if something was stopping them from going higher. Evan thought about the structure in Laura's photograph. The massive arc, the defined edges. If that structure existed at around 200 miles, and if the missiles were experiencing electrical failures as they approached that altitude, And maybe those failures weren't failures at all. Maybe they were countermeasures. He needed more information about what the scientists had been thinking. The official reports were sanitized, but scientists talked to each other. They shared ideas. They wrote proposals. He started searching for references to high-altitude phenomena in the scientific literature from the early 1960s. Most papers were about the radiation belts themselves. Van Allen's work, studies of solar particles, magnetosphere physics, standard space science. But he found a few odd references buried in conference proceedings and grant proposals. A 1960 proposal from the Air Force Office of Scientific Research referenced containment boundary studies at orbital altitudes. A 1961 symposium abstract mentioned artificial structures in near-Earth space environment. A 1963 grant application from Douglas Aircraft Company described resonance mapping of high-altitude geometric structures. These weren't mainstream topics. They were buried in technical documents that most people would never read. But they were there. A scattered paper trail suggesting that some scientists were investigating something unusual at high altitude. Evan started making phone calls. He needed to talk to anyone who'd been involved in these obscure projects. It took him 4 days to find someone willing to talk. Richard Torres, retired engineer from Douglas Aircraft Company, 78 years old, living in Henderson, Nevada, just outside Las Vegas. He'd worked on classified aerospace projects throughout the 1960s. "You're asking about some pretty old stuff," Torres said when Evan called. "Most of it's probably still classified." "I'm just trying to understand some anomalous data from the Fishbowl tests," Evan said carefully. "I found a reference to resonance mapping work at Douglas in '63. Was that related to the nuclear tests?" A long silence on the other end. "Mr. Torres?" "I worked on something in '63, Torres said slowly. "Suborbital resonance mapping system. It was a weird project. We built equipment to measure echo patterns at high altitude. I never knew what it was for. They never told us. We just built the hardware and processed the data." "What kind of data?" "Reflection patterns. We were using high-powered radar to map something above the atmosphere. The signals would go up, hit something and bounce back. We'd measure the return signal and create a map." "A map of what?" "I didn't know at the time. I just processed numbers, created topographical plots, sent the results up the chain. But the plots showed structure, geometry, regular patterns at specific altitudes." Evan's heart rate increased. "What kind of altitude?" 200 to 240 miles, right in the lower orbital range. The structure was massive, curved, like we were mapping the inside of a sphere. "Did anyone ever tell you what you were mapping?" "No. The project shut down in November '63. Abrupt termination. They dismantled the equipment, reassigned all the personnel. My supervisor told me to forget I'd ever worked on it." "Do you have any documentation from the project?" "I wasn't supposed to keep anything, but I made copies of some reports. I thought someday people might want to know what we'd been working on. After all this time, I figure the classification has probably expired." Evan felt a surge of excitement. "Would you be willing to share those copies with me?" Another silence. "Can you come to Henderson?" Torres asked. "I don't like talking about this on the phone." 2 days later, Evan was sitting in Richard Torres's living room. The house was modest, filled with photographs of grandchildren and mementos from a long aerospace career. Torres moved slowly, age and arthritis limiting his mobility, but his mind was sharp. He handed Evan a folder. Old photocopies, yellowed with age. The paper stock dated from the 1960s. "Space Cave Preliminary Report, July 1963, the cover page read. Evan opened the folder carefully. The documents inside were marked with security classifications that had probably expired decades ago. He started reading. The first page described the project purpose in careful bureaucratic language. Development of suborbital resonance mapping capability for detection of structured phenomena at high altitude. The second page detailed the equipment specifications, high-powered radar transmitters, sensitive receivers, signal processing equipment, all designed to detect echoes from objects in low orbit. but it was the data section that made Evan's hands tremble. Test results from July 10th through July 30th, 1963 show consistent reflection signatures at altitudes between 210 and 240 miles. Reflection strength indicates solid or semi-solid material with geometric properties. Structure appears symmetrical across multiple measurement angles. Estimated surface area exceeds 10,000 square miles. Curvature analysis suggests spherical or near-spherical geometry with Earth at approximate centre. Material properties unknown. Further study recommended. Evan looked up at Torres. Did you understand what this meant when you wrote it? Torres shook his head. Not at the time. I just processed the numbers. It wasn't until you sent me that photograph that I understood what we'd been looking at. You're saying there's a structure surrounding Earth at 200 miles altitude. That's what the data showed. We weren't mapping the Earth. We were mapping what's above it. Evan turned to the next page. It contained a rough plot of the reflection data, a curved line representing the structure's surface. Measurement points plotted along its length, error bars showing the uncertainty in each measurement. The curvature was consistent with a sphere centered on Earth. If you extended the arc, it would form a complete shell around the planet at approximately 220 miles altitude. What happened after this report? Evan asked. Nothing. That was the last report. 2 weeks later they shut the project down, told us it was budget cuts, but I talked to the other engineers. They detected something, and someone high up decided we shouldn't be looking at it. Do you know who made that decision? No, but it came from somewhere with serious authority. The project had Air Force funding, good funding. Projects like that don't get cancelled unless someone very important wants them cancelled. Evan photographed every page of the report. Torres watched him work, then said something that made Evan's blood run cold. You know what the weird part was? We kept detecting the structure for weeks after the project ended. What do you mean? The equipment was still running for a while. We hadn't dismantled it yet, so I kept taking measurements. Unauthorised, but nobody was paying attention anymore. The structure was still there. Same altitude, same curvature, same reflection properties. Whatever it was permanent, not temporary, not experimental. It had been there all along, and we'd only just noticed it. Evan thought about the timeline. Argus in 58, 4 years of analysis. Fishbowl in 62, trying to reach higher altitudes. Space Cave in 63, mapping what was up there. And then silence, complete shutdown of any investigation. Mr. Torres, in your professional opinion, what was that structure? Torres was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was careful, measured. I'm an engineer, not a scientist. I deal with things I can measure and calculate. The measurement said there was structure at high altitude, solid material, geometric patterns, spherical curvature. Those are facts. What it means. He shook his head. That's above my pay grade, but I'll tell you what I think. Someone put something up there, a long time ago, long before we had rockets or satellites, and in the 60s we finally got high enough to notice it. Who put it there? That's the question, isn't it? That's the question they didn't want us asking. Evan thanked Torres and drove back to his hotel. He sat in the parking lot for an hour, looking through the photographs he'd taken of the Space Cave report. Everything pointed to the same conclusion. There was a structure surrounding Earth at high altitude. The military had known about it since at least Argus in 58. They'd tried to investigate it with nuclear weapons in 62. They'd tried to map it with radar in 63. And then they'd classified everything and shut down all research. But why? What was so threatening about a structure in orbit that it required total suppression? Evan thought about Dyson's note from the symposium. Not invasion. Containment. They weren't worried about something attacking Earth. They were worried about something keeping humanity confined. A cage. A barrier. A wall between us and the rest of space. And the government had decided we weren't ready to know about it. Chapter 3. The hidden programs. Back in his office, Evan pinned the Space Cave report photographs to his wall next to Laura's image. The structure in the photograph matched the description in the report. Same altitude, same curvature, same geometric properties. 2 independent sources, a photograph from 62, a radar mapping report from 63, both showing the same thing. But he needed to know more about the government's response. How had they organised the cover-up? Who was involved? What programs had been created to study this phenomenon in secret? He started searching for references to high-altitude research programs from the 1960s. Not the public programs like Mercury and Gemini, the classified ones. The programs that existed in budget documents but nowhere else. Project Defender caught his attention first. Defender had been an early missile defence initiative from the late 1950s and early 60s. The official goal was to develop systems for shooting down Soviet ICBMs. Evan had written about Defender in his second book. He thought he knew the program well, but when he requested the complete archive of Defender documents, he found references he'd missed before. Sky Shield, Phase 2, Containment Interference Studies. That program name had been buried in a budget allocation document from 1961. Evan had skimmed past it years ago, assuming it was just another missile defence sub-study. Now he looked at it more carefully. The document listed 3 principal scientists: Nicholas Christopoulos, Greek physicist. He'd proposed the original concept for Operation Argus, the idea of using nuclear weapons to create artificial radiation belts. Brilliant but controversial, he'd worked on numerous classified projects throughout the 50s and 60s. Hans Bethe, Manhattan Project scientist, Nobel Prize winner, one of the most respected physicists of his generation. If Bethe was involved, this was serious theoretical work. Edward Teller, father of the hydrogen bomb, controversial figure known for pushing the boundaries of nuclear weapons design. He'd championed numerous extreme concepts, including nuclear-powered rockets and weapons that could destroy entire continents. These weren't minor researchers. These were 3 of the most important physicists in the American nuclear program. Their involvement suggested Sky Shield was more than a simple missile defense study. Evan found a digitized copy of the 1961 Sky Shield planning meeting notes. Most of the document was routine discussion of radar systems and tracking protocols, but in the margins, someone had made handwritten notes. The handwriting matched Nicholas Christopoulos' signature on other documents. Evan had seen enough of Christopoulos' papers to recognise his distinctive style. The note read, "Barrier exists. Question is, natural or manufactured?" Evan stared at that sentence. Barrier exists, not might exist, not possibly exists, exists. Present tense, definite. And the question wasn't whether it existed. The question was its origin, natural or manufactured. This was written in early 1961, before the Fishbowl tests, which meant they'd already known about the barrier before they started detonating nuclear weapons near it. Fishbowl hadn't been an exploratory test. It had been a targeted investigation of something they already knew was there. Evan dug deeper into the Defender archives. He found a second reference to Sky Shield in a 1962 technical review. This one mentioned radiation barrier properties and containment field interactions. Those weren't missile defense terms. Those were terms for studying a physical barrier at high altitude. He found a third reference in a 1963 document. This one was more explicit. Sky Shield. Phase 2 concluded that barrier phenomenon represents structured material of unknown origin. Conventional detection methods insufficient. Nuclear probe testing recommended. See Operation Fishbowl results for preliminary data. There it was. Direct confirmation that Sky Shield and Fishbowl were connected. They'd been studying the same barrier, and Fishbowl had been the nuclear probe testing phase. But the document was dated September 1963, after Fishbowl had ended, which meant this was a post-operation assessment, looking back at what they'd learned. Evan searched for any Sky Shield documents after 63. He found nothing. The program appeared to have ended abruptly, just like Space Cave. As if someone had decided all investigation should stop, he needed to find other programs that might have been studying this. The government wouldn't just give up on something this significant. They'd continue investigating, but under different program names, deeper classification, compartmentalized security. He started looking for references to atmospheric or orbital research in the mid-1960s. Anything that seemed unusually classified or involved the same scientists who'd worked on Sky Shield. He found several curious program references. Project HARP, High Altitude Research Program. Official purpose was studying ballistics and satellite deployment, but one budget document mentioned barrier penetration studies. Project GREAT, Geophysical Research at Extended Altitude Trajectories. This one was explicitly about launching probes above 200 miles, but funding ended abruptly in late 1962. Project Upshot, classification level so high that most documents just reference the program name without describing its purpose. But one personnel transfer order mentioned orbital boundary investigations. These programs had all operated in the early to mid-60s, all focused on high altitude, all classified, all terminated around 1963 or 64. The pattern was clear. The government had been running multiple programs to study the barrier, and then they'd shut all of them down simultaneously. Something had happened in 63 that made them decide investigation was too dangerous. Evan needed to know what that decision point was. He started looking for high-level policy documents from that period. He found it in a CIA memorandum from 1978. The memo had been declassified in 2012, but it had never been indexed properly, so it had languished in the archives unnoticed. OPF B-72, Post-Fishbowl Assessment. The date was interesting. 1978. 16 years after Fishbowl. Why were they doing a post-operation assessment so long after the tests? The memo was addressed to 4 recipients. Robert Varney, NASA official. He'd been involved in early satellite programs and had high-level security clearances. Colonel Francis Kane, Air Force Space Systems Division, career military officer specializing in orbital systems. Lloyd Berkner, geophysicist, pioneer in ionosphere research. He'd been on advisory committees for numerous classified programs, and one name that was redacted. Just a black rectangle where the name should have been. The memo's content was mostly administrative. Discussion of whether Fishbowl-related documents should remain classified. Assessment of whether the data was still sensitive 16 years later. But the final paragraph made Evan's pulse quicken. Recommend total suppression of all evidence of the barrier phenomenon discovered during OPFB activities. Continued investigation poses unacceptable risk to social stability and international relations. Current monitoring protocols should continue indefinitely, but no new active investigation authorized. This position unchanged since original 63 directive. Barrier phenomenon, capital letters. They'd given it an official name, and the recommendation was total suppression. Not just classification, suppression, erasure of evidence, because investigation posed unacceptable risk to social stability. Evan thought about what that meant. Social stability, not national security, not military advantage, social stability. They weren't worried about the Soviets learning about this. They were worried about the public learning about it. What would happen if humanity discovered there was a physical barrier preventing us from leaving Earth? What would that do to our sense of purpose, our space program, our philosophical and religious frameworks? The 1960s had been the height of space race optimism. We'd put men in orbit. We were planning moon landings. The future seemed unlimited. Space was the new frontier. How would people have reacted to learning that Frontier had a wall? That we were confined? Contained? Evan understood the suppression now. Not because the information was militarily sensitive, because it was psychologically destabilizing. Better to let people believe space was open and accessible than to tell them we were living in a cage. But the memo mentioned continued monitoring, which meant they hadn't stopped watching the barrier. They'd just stopped investigating it actively. Evan started looking for modern surveillance programs that might be monitoring high-altitude phenomena. This was harder. Recent programs were still classified. FOIA requests would take years to process, and most information would be heavily redacted. But he found a curious reference in an NSA budget justification from 1986. Continued surveillance of anomalous orbital reflections at radiative boundary layers. The memo was signed by Lieutenant General William Odom. He'd been NSA director in the mid-80s. Anomalous orbital reflections. Radiative boundary layers. They were still watching it. Still measuring it. 40 years after Fishbowl. Which meant the barrier was permanent, not a temporary phenomenon. Not an experimental installation. It had been there in the 50s. It had been there in the 60s. And it was still there in the 80s. And presumably still there now. Evan thought about the implications. A permanent structure at orbital altitude, surrounding the entire Earth, existing since before we had the technology to detect it. Someone had built this. Something had built this. And our government had known about it for 70 years and never told anyone. He needed one more piece of confirmation. He needed to find evidence that modern scientists were still encountering the barrier. He started searching for references to unusual observations from recent space missions. Satellite anomalies, atmospheric measurements that didn't fit models, anything that might indicate modern sensors were still detecting the structure. He found several curious reports. A 2012 NASA technical paper mentioned unexpected radar returns from orbital altitudes inconsistent with debris or satellite signatures. A 2016 Air Force Space Command memo referenced persistent anomalous readings from DSP satellites at radiative boundary regions. A 2019 SpaceX engineering report noted intermittent signal reflections from high-altitude sources, origin unknown. These were all carefully worded to avoid suggesting anything definitive, but the pattern was there. Modern spacecraft were still detecting something at the same altitude where the barrier had been observed in the 60s. Evan compiled everything into a timeline. 1958, Argus tests detect anomalous responses at high altitude. 1961, Sky Shield confirms barrier exists. 1962, Fishbowl attempts nuclear probe testing of barrier. 1963, Space Cave maps barrier with radar. All programs terminated. 1978, Assessment recommends continued suppression. 1986, NSA confirms continued surveillance. 2000 to present. Modern spacecraft still detecting the structure. 70 years of evidence. Multiple independent confirmations and complete suppression of the information. Evan sat back and looked at his research wall. Photographs, documents, timelines, quotes from scientists. All of it pointing to one inescapable conclusion. Earth was enclosed, not by accident, not by natural phenomenon, by design. Something or someone had built a physical barrier around our planet. A shell at approximately 220 miles altitude, large enough to be visible from the ground under the right conditions, solid enough to reflect nuclear shock waves, permanent enough to persist for at least 70 years. And the United States government had discovered it in the 1950s and decided humanity wasn't ready to know. Chapter 4. The modern connection. Evan might have stopped there, written a book, made his case with historical documents, but he wanted to know if the barrier was still being observed by modern systems. He started monitoring space industry news more carefully. SpaceX launches, satellite deployments, International Space Station operations, anything that might involve spacecraft operating near the 200-mile altitude where the barrier existed. Most launches went smoothly. Satellites deployed successfully. No unusual reports, but occasionally there were anomalies that caught his attention. In 2022, SpaceX launched a batch of Starlink satellites. These communication satellites operate in low Earth orbit, typically between 300 and 400 miles altitude. They carry cameras for Earth imaging and solar monitoring. One of these satellites captured an unusual image during a solar observation session. The image showed the sun's corona, but in the foreground there was a faint arc, a curve that didn't match any known orbital debris or satellite constellation pattern. NASA's explanation was brief. Sensor ghosting artifact common in space-based optical systems. No anomaly detected. But Evan obtained the raw image data through a contact at SpaceX. When he processed the image with enhanced contrast, the arc became clearer. It had depth, shadow properties, three-dimensional structure. He overlaid the arc with Laura's photograph from the Fishbowl film. The geometry matched. Exactly. Same curvature, same altitude, same relative position to Earth's horizon. Whatever had been there in 1962 was still there 60 years later. Evan documented the match and started looking for other modern observations. He found several. A 2018 paper by Chinese satellite researchers mentioned unexpected microwave reflections from atmospheric boundary regions. A 2019 International Space Station crew report noted unusual visual phenomena during orbital sunrise at approximately 220 miles altitude. A 2020 amateur radio operator community discussion described persistent signal bouncing from unknown source at low orbital altitudes. None of these reports explicitly acknowledged a structure, but they all described observations consistent with a physical barrier at the same altitude. Evan found one more interesting reference, an astronaut quote that had been quickly dismissed as a misstatement. Jeremy Hansen, Canadian astronaut, highly experienced, not prone to making careless statements. In 2014, he'd given a presentation at a university about his time aboard the International Space Station. During the Q&A session, a student asked about the challenges of operating at orbital altitudes. Hansen's response was recorded. There are things I can't talk about regarding the upper atmospheric boundary, but I can say that the environment at those altitudes is more complex than the public realises. We observe phenomena that aren't fully explained by current models. Within hours, NASA issued a clarification. Hansen had been referring to classified military satellite operations. Nothing unusual, just standard operational security. But Evan noticed the specific phrase, upper atmospheric boundary. Not space, not orbit, boundary. The same terminology that kept appearing in the classified documents from the 60s. Barrier, boundary, containment. Hansen wasn't talking about satellites. He was talking about the structure. Evan tried to contact Hansen for an interview. The request was declined. Hansen's management company sent a polite email saying he wasn't available for interviews about technical spaceflight topics. But the quote was on record, and it matched everything else Evan had found. He compiled all the modern evidence into a comprehensive report. The historical tests from the 60s, the mapping data from Space Cave, the CIA memoranda, the NSA surveillance references, the modern satellite observations, the astronaut statement. All of it pointing to the same conclusion. There was a structure surrounding Earth. It had been there for at least 70 years, possibly much longer, and our government knew about it and was actively suppressing the information. Evan prepared to publish. He had enough evidence, enough documentation, enough credibility as a researcher to get mainstream attention. He wrote a draft article, 15,000 words, footnoted, carefully worded. He wasn't claiming to know what the structure was or who built it. He was simply presenting the evidence that it existed and that the government knew about it. He sent the draft to 3 colleagues for peer review. All 3 were experienced researchers who'd published on classified programs before. He trusted them to give honest feedback. 2 of them responded positively. The evidence was compelling. The documentation was solid. They encouraged him to publish. The 3rd colleague, a retired Air Force intelligence officer, sent a different kind of response. "Evan, this is fascinating work, but I need to warn you. This topic is actively protected. Not just classified, protected. I've seen researchers lose their careers investigating similar phenomena. Be very careful about who you share this with." Evan appreciated the warning, but he'd already decided. The evidence needed to be public. People deserved to know. He contacted several science journalists he'd worked with before. He offered them the story, exclusive access to all his documentation. One journalist was interested. She worked for a major magazine with a reputation for serious investigative reporting. They set up a meeting. That night, Evan's phone died. Not low battery, completely dead. Wouldn't turn on, wouldn't charge, just a black screen. He tried his backup phone, same thing, dead within minutes. His laptop shut down while he was working on it, completely unresponsive. The hard drive was wiped, every file gone. His external backup drives locked themselves with encryption he hadn't applied, password prompts he couldn't bypass. His cloud storage accounts were deleted. All files vanished. In the span of 4 hours, every digital device he owned became useless. Every file he'd accumulated over 6 months of research was gone. Evans sat in his office, surrounded by dead electronics, trying to understand what had just happened. Then he saw the message. It appeared on his dead laptop screen. The screen that had been black and unresponsive seconds ago. White text on black background. No windows, no interface. Just text. "You're investigating a classified structure. This is your final warning." The message displayed for 5 seconds, then the screen went black again. Evan felt his chest tighten. They'd been watching him. They knew everything he'd been researching, and they just demonstrated they could reach into his personal electronics at will. He left his office immediately, packed a bag from his apartment, took only cash and paper documents, left all his electronics behind. He checked into a hotel in Cincinnati 2 hours from his home. He used a fake name and paid cash. He needed time to think. Someone had been monitoring his research, someone with resources beyond what he'd imagined. Not just classified programs, not just government agencies, something with reach into private infrastructure, private companies, private networks. They could access his devices remotely, delete files across multiple platforms simultaneously, display messages on powered-down screens. That level of capability wasn't normal government surveillance. That was something else, something with backdoor access to fundamental internet infrastructure. Evan spent 3 days in hotel rooms, moving between cities, trying to figure out his next move. He couldn't use computers, couldn't use phones, couldn't access any of his research digitally. But he still had one thing, the original USB drive Laura had sent him, the one with the photograph. He'd kept it separate from his other backups, stored in a safety deposit box at his bank. He retrieved it and looked at the image again. The arc, the structure, the impossible object that shouldn't exist. This was the only copy left. Everything else had been erased. He needed to get this image out to the public before they found a way to delete it too. He went to a public library, used their computers with a VPN and multiple proxy servers, created anonymous accounts on multiple platforms, prepared to upload the image everywhere simultaneously. Before he uploaded, he wrote a brief explanation. Just the key facts, no speculation, just evidence. Then he uploaded everything at once. Reddit, Twitter, image hosting sites, conspiracy forums, file-sharing networks, everywhere he could think of. For about 4 hours it spread. People started seeing it, discussing it, analysing it, comparing it to other space photographs. The conversation was building momentum. Then it started disappearing. Post by post, platform by platform, the image was being removed. Not just his original uploads, the copies people had made, screenshots, downloads, everything. Within 12 hours, every instance of the image was gone. Even the people who'd saved it to their personal devices reported that the files had corrupted or disappeared. Evan tried uploading it. again from the library computer. His accounts were immediately suspended. Permanent bans, no appeals. He created new accounts. They were banned before he could post anything. He tried other libraries, other cities. Same result. Instant bans. Immediate removal. Whatever surveillance system he'd triggered was comprehensive. They were watching every public computer he accessed, every account he created, every file he tried to upload. The net was complete. Evan sat in his car in a library parking lot holding the USB drive, trying to figure out what to do next. He thought about the journalists he'd contacted. He called one of them from a payphone. She answered. "I can't talk about this," she said immediately. "I've been advised that the story isn't viable." "Who advised you?" "I can't say, but the message was clear. This isn't a story we're going to pursue. I'm sorry, Evan." She hung up. He tried the other journalists, same response. Polite refusals, no explanation. Just sudden disinterest in a story they'd been excited about days earlier. Someone had gotten to them, applied pressure, made it clear this story wasn't to be published. Evan had one option left: physical distribution. He couldn't rely on digital systems, but he could mail copies to people, create physical documentation that couldn't be remotely deleted. He wrote out his entire investigation by hand. 20 pages. Key facts, document references, contact information for everyone he'd interviewed. He made 10 copies at a print shop paying cash. He addressed them to 3 different journalists, 2 university researchers, 3 science writers, and 2 documentary filmmakers. People he trusted, people with platforms, people who might be willing to take risks. He mailed them from different post offices in different cities, used fake return addresses, spread the mailings across a week to avoid pattern detection. Then he waited. 2 weeks later, he started getting responses. Every envelope had arrived empty, just blank pages. They'd intercepted physical mail, opened the envelopes, removed the contents, resealed them, all without leaving evidence of tampering. That level of operational capability suggested resources beyond any single agency. This wasn't just the CIA or NSA. This was coordinated action across multiple systems: postal service, internet infrastructure, financial networks, media companies. Someone wanted this information buried, and they had the power to make it happen across every possible distribution channel. Evan realised he was dealing with something much bigger than he had understood. This wasn't just about a classified program. This was about controlling information at a fundamental level. Controlling what humanity was allowed to know about its own planet, and they were willing to use extraordinary measures to maintain that control. Chapter 5. The final attempt. Evan had one last idea. A peer-to-peer file-sharing network, the kind that distributed data across thousands of computers simultaneously, making it nearly impossible to eliminate completely. If he could get the file seeded into one of these networks, it would propagate beyond any single point of control. Even if they deleted most copies, some would survive. Eventually someone would notice. Eventually the evidence would reach critical mass. He spent his last free day preparing the file, the photograph, a written summary of his findings, excerpts from the documents he'd photographed, contact information for Margaret Reeves and Richard Torres, everything he could fit into a compressed archive. He encrypted it using open-source software, set up a Tor node, prepared to upload it to multiple peer-to-peer networks simultaneously. He chose networks that were designed for exactly this kind of distributed archiving. Networks where files persisted even if the original uploader went offline. Networks that were used by journalists and activists to preserve documents that powerful organizations wanted destroyed. He initiated the upload from a coffee shop in Detroit. The file began propagating, node to node, computer to computer, each copy creating more copies, distributed across the network in fragments, no single machine holding the complete file. For 6 hours, it worked. The file spread. The distribution counter climbed. 10,000 copies, 20,000, 50,000. People started accessing it, downloading it, opening it, reading the evidence. Evan monitored the network activity from the coffee shop. He watched the counter climb, watched the geographic distribution spread across continents. Then it started dropping. Slowly at first, a few nodes going offline, then faster, hundreds of nodes, thousands. Something was sweeping through the network, deleting the file, not just from new uploads, from existing nodes, from computers that had already downloaded it. Evan watched in real time as the counter dropped. 50,000 copies, 40,000, 20,000, 10,000, 5,000, 1,000, 100, 0. They'd eliminated it from a distributed network, something that should have been technically impossible. They'd found a way to remotely delete files from thousands of individual computers simultaneously. The scope of that capability was staggering. That wasn't normal law enforcement. That wasn't standard intelligence agency power. That was infrastructure-level access, backdoors into operating systems, control over fundamental internet protocols. Evan closed his laptop and left the coffee shop. He didn't know if they could track his physical location yet, but he wasn't going to risk staying in one place. He drove to a park, sat on a bench, thought about what he'd learned over the past 6 months. A structure surrounding Earth, confirmed by multiple independent sources, nuclear tests in the 60s, radar mapping in the 60s, modern satellite observations, astronaut statements, all pointing to the same thing. A government cover-up spanning 70 years, classification, suppression, active denial, scientists silenced, programs terminated, evidence destroyed, and a surveillance and control apparatus capable of reaching into any digital system anywhere in the world to eliminate information they didn't want public. Evan pulled out his phone. He'd bought a new one, prepaid, cash purchase. He recorded one final message. "My name is Evan Mercer. I'm an aerospace historian. For the past 6 months I've been investigating evidence of a structure surrounding Earth at high altitude. Evidence that our government has known about this structure since 1958. Evidence that they attempted to break through it using nuclear weapons in 1962. Evidence that they've been hiding this truth for over 70 years. I've documented everything: historical tests, classified memos, scientific reports, modern observations. All of it confirms the same thing. There's a physical barrier at approximately 220 miles altitude. It's been there since before we had the technology to detect it, and our government decided we're not allowed to know about it. I've been threatened. My research has been destroyed. Every digital file I had has been erased. The people I interviewed have been silenced or have recanted their statements. Every attempt I've made to share this information has been blocked. But I need you to know something. The evidence is real. The structure is real. And they're hiding it because they know what it means. We're not explorers looking out at the universe. We're specimens being kept in. And someone decided a long time ago that we're better off not knowing that." He uploaded the video to a temporary hosting site. It lasted 40 minutes before being removed. Long enough for a few hundred people to see it, but not long enough to spread widely. Evan had one more thing to do. The USB drive with Laura's original photograph, the only copy that still existed. He couldn't distribute it digitally. They'd just delete it. He couldn't mail it domestically. They'd intercept it. But he had a friend in Norway, Lars Johansen. They'd met at a conference years ago. Lars worked at a small research institute outside Oslo. He was outside the American intelligence sphere, outside the immediate reach of whoever was suppressing this information. Evan packaged the USB drive in a waterproof case, addressed it to Lars at his institute, sent it via international express mail from a random post office in Indiana. Then he drove back to his apartment in Columbus. He knew what was coming. They'd let him run for weeks, probably watching to see who he contacted, what methods he tried, how far his information spread. Now they'd closed the loop. 2 men in civilian suits were waiting in his hallway when he arrived. Not police, not FBI agents with badges and warrants. Just 2 men who looked like they could be accountants or insurance salesmen, unremarkable, forgettable, except for their eyes, alert, trained, dangerous in a way that didn't require visible weapons. "Mr. Mercer," one of them said, "we need you to come with us." Evan didn't resist. He'd known this was coming. He'd done everything he could. Now it was out of his hands. "Where are we going?" he asked. "A debriefing facility. You'll be briefed on information classification procedures. You'll sign some documents. Then you'll go home. And if I don't sign..." The man smiled. It wasn't a friendly expression. "Then the debriefing takes longer, but the outcome is the same. You'll sign." They escorted him to an unmarked sedan. Dark windows, no government plates. Just an anonymous vehicle that could have belonged to anyone. As they drove, Evan looked out the window at the city passing by. He thought about Laura Benton, who disappeared after seeing that film reel. About Margaret Reeves, who'd told him about the structure and then recanted. About Richard Torres, who'd kept documentation for 40 years and finally shared it. He thought about all the scientists who'd seen the evidence and chosen silence. Van Allen, Christophelos, Wolfe, Craven. Men who'd made careers studying space and then stopped asking certain questions. He thought about the structure itself, the massive arc in Laura's photograph, the radar returns in the Space Cave report, the modern satellite observations, 70 years of evidence, all pointing to the same impossible truth. Something surrounded Earth. Something that had been there longer than our space program. Something that someone had decided we weren't allowed to know about. And he thought about Dyson's handwritten note from the symposium. Not invasion, containment. That's what this was. Not protection from external threats. Containment of humanity. A barrier keeping us confined to our planet. The question nobody had asked yet was the most important one. Who built it, and why? Epilogue. The frame that survived. 3 months after Evan Mercer was escorted into an unmarked sedan, a package arrived at the Nansen Institute for Environmental Research in Oslo, Norway. Lars Johansen, atmospheric physicist, received the package at his office. It had been sitting in customs for 2 weeks before finally being released. No explanation for the delay. Just a stamp indicating it had been inspected and cleared. Inside was a waterproof case. Inside that, a USB drive. Inside that, a single image file and a text document explaining what it showed. Lars opened the image. His first thought was that it was another nuclear test photograph. He'd seen dozens of them. Declassified images from the Cold War, nothing unusual. But then he read Evan's explanation. The date, the altitude, the structure that appeared for half a second during the flash. Lars enhanced the image, adjusted contrast, increased brightness, isolated the structure from the background radiation, and he saw what Evan had seen, a massive arc, regular curvature, defined edges, something solid at 200 miles altitude. But Lars went further. He had access to image processing software that Evan hadn't used. Software designed for analysing satellite imagery and telescopic observations. He applied spectral analysis to the structure, measured the light reflectivity, analysed the shadow patterns. The structure wasn't just a barrier, it had features. Lars zoomed in on the enhanced version. Behind the main arc, barely visible in the original, now clear after processing, were lights. Not stars. The wavelength was wrong. The pattern was wrong. These were artificial lights, arranged in patterns, geometric shapes, a grid. Lars felt his chest tighten. He zoomed in further. The lights were regularly spaced, precise intervals, mathematical regularity. And between the lights there were shapes, structural elements, what looked like support frameworks or attachment points. This wasn't a natural phenomenon. This wasn't even an accident of human construction. This was engineered. Someone had built this. Something had built this. Lars saved the enhanced image. He stared at it for 20 minutes, trying to wrap his mind around what he was seeing. A wall around Earth, a constructed barrier, covered in lights and structures, surrounding the entire planet. He thought about the implications. Every space mission had launched through this barrier. Every satellite that reached orbit had passed through it. Every astronaut who'd looked out the window had potentially seen it. And nobody had said anything. Or if they had, they'd been silenced. Lars reached for his phone to call colleagues, to share this, to start asking questions. Then he stopped. He thought about what had happened to Evan, the destroyed research, the deleted files, the intercepted mail, the men who'd taken him away. He thought about what Evan had written in his explanation. They will do anything to keep this secret. Be careful who you trust. Lars looked at the enhanced image again, the lights, the grid, the structure. Some truths he realised were bigger than one person's need to share them. Some truths required preparation, planning, the right moment, the right circumstances. If he published this now, it would be deleted like everything else. He'd be silenced like everyone else, and the evidence would be lost again. But if he waited, if he preserved it carefully, if he prepared the ground properly, someday conditions might change. Someday the control apparatus might weaken. Someday enough people might be asking the right questions that the truth couldn't be suppressed anymore. Lars deleted the enhanced image from his computer, but he saved it to 3 encrypted drives, stored them in separate locations, created detailed instructions for accessing them to be opened only if specific conditions were met. He wrote a letter explaining everything, sealed it, left instructions, with his attorney to deliver it to specific people if he died or disappeared. Then he went back to his normal research: atmospheric measurements, climate modelling, ordinary science. But every night he looked up at the stars and thought about what he knew, about the wall just beyond the edge of space, about the lights and structures that covered it, about the question that nobody was allowed to ask. If there's a barrier keeping us in, who built it, and why? The answer to that question, Lars suspected, was the real reason for the suppression. Not just that the barrier existed, but what its existence implied about humanity's place in the universe. We weren't the explorers we thought we were something else. And whoever built that barrier had decided we should stay contained, at least for now. Until then, the frame remained, hidden but preserved, encrypted but recoverable, waiting for the right moment, waiting for conditions to change, waiting for the day when humanity would finally be ready to learn the truth about what happened in 1962, about what our government discovered, about what still hangs above us, silent and watching, keeping us contained. The truth about the barrier, the truth about Operation Fishbowl, the truth about the wall we can't cross, and about the lights on the other side, the lights that suggest we're not alone, that we've never been alone, that something has been watching us, managing us, containing us, for reasons we're not yet allowed to understand. Someday someone will ask the questions again. Someday someone will find the evidence Lars preserved. Someday the control will slip and the truth will emerge. And when it does, humanity will have to confront the most fundamental question we've ever faced. If we're being contained, what happens when they decide to let us out? Or worse, what happens if they never do? What if everything you thought you knew about those mysterious men in black suits was just the beginning? Tonight's story comes from a video suggestion by Kelly Dooley, and it's one that will make you question every shadow at your window and every unexplained silence in your neighbourhood. If you enjoy these spine-chilling tales, please like and subscribe to Sleep Theories, and don't forget to leave your own scary story suggestions in the comments below. Now, let's dive into a tale of surveillance, secrets, and the terrifying price of knowing too much. The October wind carried the smell of dying leaves and something else I couldn't quite place as I pulled into the gravel driveway of 1247 Maple Street. Something metallic and stale, like coins left too long in stagnant water. I'd been working welfare checks for Millfield County for 3 years, and that smell usually meant one thing: I was too late. Henry Mallory's house sat like a dark wound against the grey afternoon sky. Every window was covered with what looked like blackout curtains, the kind photographers use, but these were different somehow. Thicker, more deliberate. The mailbox overflowed with weeks of accumulated mail, and newspapers in yellow plastic bags lay scattered across the brown lawn like forgotten promises. I knocked on the front door, calling out the standard greeting I'd rehearsed hundreds of times. "Mr. Mallory, this is Jamie from Millfield County Social Services. We're here for a wellness check." The words echoed back at me, swallowed by the unnatural quiet that seemed to press against the house from all sides. No answer, no movement, not even the shuffle of slippered feet or the distant sound of a television that usually accompanied these visits. I tried the door handle, locked, walked the perimeter, checking windows, looking for any sign of life or entry. The blackout curtains were installed on the inside of every single window, creating an impenetrable barrier between the interior and the outside world. When I pressed my ear against the glass of what might have been a living room window, I heard something that made my skin crawl. The steady hiss of television static playing endlessly like white noise. The spare key was exactly where Mrs. Henderson next door said it would be, under the ceramic frog by the back steps. As I turned it in the lock, that metallic smell hit me full force, and I knew what I was walking into. Henry Mallory sat in a brown recliner facing an old cathode ray television, the screen filled with dancing static. His head was tilted back at an unnatural angle, mouth slightly open, eyes fixed on something I couldn't see. The calendar on the kitchen wall was still turned to October 15th, though today was the 29th. 2 weeks, maybe longer. The house felt wrong in a way that went beyond death. It was too quiet, even accounting for the obvious. No hum of a refrigerator, no ticking clocks, no settling sounds that old houses make. Just that constant static from the television, and a silence so complete it felt like being underwater. I called the coroner and settled in to wait, doing my job of securing the scene and documenting what I found. That's when I really started looking around. Every surface was covered in a thin layer of dust except for well-worn paths between the kitchen, bathroom and living room. But what caught my attention were the notebooks, dozens of them, stacked on every available surface filled with Henry's spidery handwriting. I opened one at random, October 3rd, 2025. Black sedan, licence obscured, parked across street 11:47 p.m. to 4:23 a.m. 2 occupants, no movement. September 28th, 2025. Phone rang 17 times between 2 a.m. and 5 a.m. No voice when answered. September 15th, 2025. Footprints in garden. Size unknown. Pattern suggests standing in place for extended period. Page after page of similar entries going back months. I flipped to earlier notebooks and found the dates stretched back years. Decades even. All documenting the same kinds of things. Unexplained visitors, strange cars, odd occurrences that might seem mundane to anyone else but had clearly consumed Henry Mallory's life. The coroner arrived as the sun was setting, casting long shadows through the spaces between the blackout curtains. Patricia Williams had been doing this job longer than I'd been alive, and she took one look at Henry and shook her head. "Natural causes," she said, checking his pulse points and examining his eyes with a small flashlight. "Heart, probably. Happens all the time with folks his age, especially the isolated ones. Body's been here about 2 weeks, maybe a bit more." As she worked, I found myself drawn to those notebooks, flipping through pages of meticulous documentation that painted a picture of a man living in constant fear of being watched. The handwriting grew shakier in the more recent entries, but never stopped. Right up until the day he died, Henry Mallory had been taking notes. "You okay?" Patricia asked as she finished her examination. "You look pale." "Just the smell," I lied, though the truth was something about this place was getting under my skin. "How long until you can remove the body?" "Van's on the way. Should be another hour or so." She packed her equipment back into her black bag. "You staying to secure the house?" I nodded. It was standard protocol. Someone from the county had to stay until next of kin were notified and arrangements made for securing the property. Henry had a nephew in California who wouldn't arrive for several days, according to our records. After Patricia left, the house seemed to grow even quieter. I wandered through the rooms, clipboard in hand, documenting personal effects for the estate. That's how I found the basement door. It was in a narrow hallway between the kitchen and what had once been a dining room but now served as Henry's filing system. More notebooks, folders full of newspaper clippings, and boxes labelled with dates stretching back to the 1970s. The basement door was painted the same dingy white as the walls, but what made it stand out was the heavy padlock securing it shut. I tried the handle anyway, locked tight. The padlock was new, industrial grade, not something you'd pick up at a hardware store. Someone had wanted to keep that door very securely closed, or keep something very securely contained. I made a note on my report. Basement access secured with padlock. Key location unknown. Will require locksmith for estate inventory. But as I wrote those words, I found myself staring at that door and wondering what Henry Mallory had thought was important enough to lock away so completely. The van arrived to collect Henry's body just as full darkness fell. I helped load him up, signed the necessary paperwork, and watched the taillights disappear down Maple Street. Then I was alone in the house with nothing but static from the television and the growing certainty that I was missing something important. Before I left, I turned off the television. The silence that followed was so complete, it felt like a physical presence. I stood there for a moment, listening to nothing, then flicked the switch back on. The static resumed, filling the void. Some silences I was learning were worse than noise. I couldn't stop thinking about that padlocked door. 3 days after we'd removed Henry's body, I was back at 1247 Maple Street with a locksmith named Pete, who charged the county $50 to cut through security hardware. The nephew in California had given permission over the phone for a complete inventory of the property, and I was determined to be thorough. "Heavy-duty stuff," Pete muttered as he examined the padlock. Guy really didn't want anyone getting in there. The lock gave way with a sharp crack, and the basement door swung open to reveal wooden stairs descending into darkness. I fumbled for a light switch and found one just inside the doorframe. A single bare bulb illuminated a stairway that looked like it hadn't been disturbed in years. "You want me to stick around?" Pete asked, peering down into the basement. "No, I've got it from here. Thanks." After he left, I stood at the top of those stairs for a long time, flashlight in hand even though the overhead light was working. Something about descending into Henry Mallory's locked basement felt like crossing a line I couldn't uncross. The stairs creaked under my weight, but they held. The basement was larger than I'd expected, running the full length of the house with a low ceiling and concrete walls that had been painted white decades ago. Now they were stained with moisture and age, creating abstract patterns in the dim light. But what took my breath away were the shelves. They lined every wall, floor to ceiling, packed with VHS tapes in neat rows like a video store from the 1980s. Each tape was labelled in Henry's careful handwriting with dates: March 15th, 1978, August 22nd, 1981, November the 7th, 1985. The dates went on and on, hundreds of them, stretching from the late 70s all the way up to 2004. In the centre of the basement sat a card table with an old camcorder, the kind that recorded directly to VHS. Beside it were boxes of film reels, some so old the labels had faded to illegibility. More notebooks, these ones bound in black leather, filled with the same spidery handwriting I'd seen upstairs. I pulled one notebook at random and opened it. June 12th, 1983. Witness, Morrison, J. Reports lights over reservoir. Local paper runs story page 3. Black sedan arrives outside Morrison residence June 14th. Morrison recounts story, June 15th. New statement, thought it was airplane. June 18th, 1983. Two men in dark suits visit newspaper office. Editor Thompson nervous when asked about Morrison story. Refuses to discuss. June 20th, 1983. Morrison family leaves town suddenly. House sold within week to cash buyer. No forwarding address. Page after page of similar entries, documenting what appeared to be a pattern of witness intimidation following unexplained sightings around Millfield. But it was more than just documentation. Henry had been actively investigating these incidents for decades. I moved to the shelves and pulled a tape at random. September 3rd, 1987 was written on the label in Henry's neat script. Below that, in smaller text, Diner, 2 a.m. There was a VHS player on a small television in the corner of the basement. The setup looked like it hadn't been disturbed in years, but everything was clean, maintained. Henry had been coming down here regularly. I slotted the tape into the player and pressed play. Grainy footage showed the interior of Henry's car at night, dashboard illuminated by streetlights. Through the windshield, I could see the Millfield Diner, a local institution that had been serving coffee and pie to night shift workers and insomniacs for as long as anyone could remember. Henry's voice came through the speaker, younger but recognisable. September 3rd, 1987, 2:15 a.m. Two vehicles in parking lot besides mine, waiting for target to emerge. The camera stayed focused on the diner's front entrance. After several minutes of nothing, a man emerged, middle-aged, wearing work clothes, moving quickly toward a pickup truck parked under a streetlight. Before he could reach his vehicle, two figures approached from the shadows. Tall men in dark suits, their faces difficult to make out in the grainy footage. They moved with an odd, synchronized precision, intercepting the worker before he could reach his truck. I leaned closer to the screen, trying to make out details. The men appeared to be speaking to the worker, though no sound carried from the diner parking lot. Their body language was somehow wrong. Too stiff, too formal for what looked like a chance encounter. The worker's posture changed as they spoke. He went from hurried to rigid, then to something that looked like fear. After several minutes of conversation, one of the suited men gestured toward a black sedan I hadn't noticed parked at the far edge of the lot. The worker followed them to the car. "Jesus," Henry's voice whispered from the tape, "they're taking him." The black sedan pulled out of the parking lot with the worker inside and disappeared down Main Street. The two men in suits got into a second vehicle and followed. Henry's narration continued. Target was Eddie Morrison, age 34, maintenance worker at the power plant. Filed UFO report with county sheriff 2 days ago. Described lights over the plant Tuesday night. Today he gets a visit. The tape ended there. I sat in the dim basement staring at the static-filled screen, trying to process what I'd just seen. Eddie Morrison. That name had been in Henry's notebook upstairs, the one who'd left town suddenly after recanting his UFO story. I looked around at the hundreds of other tapes lining the shelves. How many more stories like Eddie Morrison's were documented here? How long had Henry been watching, recording, documenting these encounters? Near the bottom shelf, one tape stood out from the others. Instead of Henry's usual neat labelling, this one was marked with black marker in urgent uneven letters. Do not destroy. If found, watch. I pulled it from the shelf with hands that were suddenly less steady than I would have liked. The basement felt colder than when I'd first come down, though the October afternoon was mild. As I held that tape, I had the distinct impression that I was about to cross another line, one that might be even harder to come back from than descending into Henry's basement in the first place. But Eddie Morrison's face stayed with me. The way he'd gone from hurried to terrified in the span of a few minutes of conversation, with two men who moved like they weren't entirely human. I needed to know what was on that final tape, but not here. Not in this basement where Henry had spent decades hiding from whatever he'd discovered. I slipped the tape into my jacket pocket and headed for the stairs, leaving the rest of Henry's archive undisturbed for now. As I reached the top of the stairs and prepared to turn off the basement light, I took one last look at those hundreds of tapes. Decades of documentation, a lifetime spent watching the watchers. Henry Mallory hadn't just been a paranoid old man after all. He'd been a chronicler of something much worse. I almost didn't watch the tape that night. I sat in my living room for 2 hours, the VHS cassette on my coffee table like an unexploded bomb, while I tried to convince myself that I was getting carried away. Henry Mallory had been an elderly man living alone, probably dealing with some form of paranoia or dementia. The tape from 1987 could have been staged, or misinterpreted, or any number of rational explanations that didn't involve mysterious men in black suits disappearing people who reported UFO sightings. But I kept thinking about Eddie Morrison's face in that parking lot, the way genuine fear had replaced annoyance when those two men approached him. Around 11 p.m, I finally slid the tape into my VCR. The footage began immediately, no FB warnings or production company logos. Just Henry's voice, older now, speaking in an urgent whisper. October 27th, 2025. If you're watching this, I'm probably dead. My name is Henry James Mallory, and for the past 47 years, I have been documenting the systematic suppression of unexplained phenomena in and around Millfield County. The camera was positioned inside Henry's house, pointing out through a gap in the blackout curtains toward the street. The timestamp in the corner showed 3:47 a.m. They know I have the footage, Henry continued. They've known for years, but something's changed. They're getting bolder, more direct. Through the window I could see a black sedan parked across the street under a broken streetlight. 2 figures stood beside it, perfectly still, facing Henry's house. They've been out there for 6 hours, Henry whispered. Same 2 as always. They don't move, don't talk to each other, don't smoke cigarettes or check their phones like normal surveillance would. They just wait. The camera stayed focused on the scene outside. In the poor lighting, it was difficult to make out details of the 2 figures, but something about their posture was deeply unsettling. They stood too straight, too perfectly aligned, like mannequins positioned by someone who had only a theoretical understanding of how humans were supposed to look while waiting. I started filming them in 1978, Henry's narration continued. Back then, I thought I was documenting some kind of government cover-up. CIA, NSA, something like that. Men in black suits showing up after UFO sightings to intimidate witnesses. It's a well-known phenomenon. On screen, one of the figures turned slightly, and for just a moment, the angle of the streetlight illuminated what might have been a face. Pale, angular features that looked somehow wrong, though I couldn't pinpoint exactly why. But government agents would change shifts. They'd have backup. They'd show signs of fatigue or boredom during long surveillances. These things, they never change. I've filmed the same 2 figures for 47 years and they haven't aged a day. The timestamp jumped forward, 4:23 a.m. The figures hadn't moved. I made mistakes early on, Henry continued. Got too close to witnesses, asked too many questions. That's when they started watching me instead of just cleaning up after sightings. Been living like this for decades now, documenting everything, hoping someone would eventually find the evidence. Another time jump. 5:15 a.m. The figures were gone, but the black sedan remained. The car will stay until sunrise, Henry said, as if reading my thoughts. Then it'll drive away. No engine noise, never any engine noise. And tonight will be just like the last 15,000 nights, except... There was a long pause in the narration. When Henry spoke again, his voice had changed, more tired, resigned. Except I think they're done waiting. I found something 2 days ago, something that explains what they are and why they're here. I hid it in the usual place, but I don't think that's going to matter anymore. The camera shifted slightly, and I caught a glimpse of Henry's reflection in the window glass. He looked exactly as I'd found him in that recliner, elderly, frail, wearing the same clothes he'd died in. If you're watching this tape, do not try to find the other footage. Do not ask questions about what happened to the witnesses. Do not go looking for explanations. His voice carried a weight of desperate sincerity. Just walk away. Some knowledge isn't worth having. The tape went to static. I rewound it and watched again, paying closer attention to details I'd missed the first time. The timestamp showed this had been recorded just 2 days before I'd found Henry's body, which meant he'd made this final recording knowing he was about to die. But knowing how? Natural causes, the coroner had said. Heart failure brought on by stress and age. Nothing suspicious about it. On the third viewing, I started taking notes. The license plate on the sedan was obscured, just like in Henry's notebooks. The two figures never made any gestures or movements that looked definitively human. And there was something about the way they stood that reminded me of how store mannequins were positioned. Anatomically correct, but lacking the subtle, unconscious shifts that living people made even when trying to stand perfectly still. I paused the tape when the streetlight briefly illuminated one of the faces and tried to make out features. Pale skin, sharp cheekbones, dark hair. Nothing that would seem unusual in normal circumstances, but in this context everything about them felt wrong. The rational part of my mind kept insisting that this was all explainable. Hidden camera footage from a paranoid elderly man, possibly staged, definitely biased by his preconceived notions about government conspiracies and UFO cover-ups. But another part of my mind, a part I usually tried to ignore, kept thinking about how quiet Henry's house had been. How the silence had felt oppressive, unnatural. How those blackout curtains had been installed with the kind of meticulous care that came from genuine long-term fear. I ejected the tape and sat in my living room until dawn, staring out my own windows at the empty street. No black sedans, no figures standing under streetlights. But for the first time in 3 years of living in this house, I found myself getting up every few minutes to check the locks. I went back to Henry's house the next morning with a box of blank VHS tapes and a portable television. If I was going to understand what had happened to him, I needed to see more of his documentation. The nephew in California had given the county permission to dispose of the contents as we saw fit, which meant I had legal access to everything in that basement archive. What I found was a systematic documentation of 47 years of witness intimidation that followed the same pattern with disturbing consistency. The earliest tapes, dating back to 1978, were filmed with equipment that produced grainy, unstable footage. But even in those early recordings, the same two figures appeared. Always the same black sedan. Always the same methodical approach to witnesses who had reported unexplained phenomena. July 14th, 1979 showed a farming family outside their house being questioned by the suited figures after reporting strange lights over their property. The farmers had initially seemed defiant, but their body language changed as the conversation progressed. By the end of the encounter, they were nodding eagerly, agreeing to something I couldn't hear. March 22nd, 1981 captured footage of the same two figures entering the Millfield Gazette office after the newspaper ran a story about multiple UFO sightings over the reservoir. The editor, who Henry identified in his narration as Thompson, 15 years experience known for integrity, emerged from the meeting looking pale and shaken. November the 8th, 1983, documented the figures visiting a local auto mechanic who'd reported seeing a disc-shaped object hovering over the interstate. The mechanic's initial statement to police had been detailed and confident. After the visit, he claimed he'd been mistaken, probably saw a helicopter. Tape after tape showed the same story. Witnesses reported something unexplained. The story appeared in local media or police reports. The two figures appeared. The witnesses recanted their stories and often left town shortly afterward. But what made my blood run cold was the consistency of the figures themselves. In 1978, they looked exactly the same as in Henry's final tape from 2025. Same height, same build, same angular features when the camera caught them in the right light. 47 years, and they hadn't aged a day. I started cross-referencing Henry's notebooks with the video footage, building a timeline of incidents. The pattern was so consistent it felt almost mechanical. Day 1. Unusual sighting reported day 2 to 3. Story appears in local media or official reports. Day 4 to 5. Black sedan appears in vicinity day 6. Direct contact with witnesses. Day 7. Witness recounts story day 8 to 14. Witness often relocates permanently, but the most disturbing tape was dated September 15th, 1996. This one was different from the others. Instead of filming from his car or house, Henry had positioned the camera in what looked like dense woods. Through the trees, I could see the Millfield Reservoir, its dark surface reflecting a cloudy afternoon sky. September 15th, 1996, Henry's voice whispered from behind the camera. Following up on the Patterson sighting from last week, multiple witnesses reported object emerging from water around midnight September 8th. The camera showed the shoreline, empty except for some scattered fishing equipment left by weekend anglers. Henry's breathing was audible, nervous. Been watching for 3 hours, nothing unusual until a black sedan emerged from the tree line, driving slowly along a dirt access road I hadn't noticed before. It parked near the shoreline, and the two familiar figures got out. But this time, they weren't approaching witnesses. They were alone at the reservoir, and their behaviour was completely different. Instead of their usual rigid, formal posture, they moved with fluid precision, like dancers performing a choreographed routine. They walked to the water's edge and stood perfectly still for several minutes, facing the centre of the reservoir. Then, without any visible signal or communication, they began to undress. I paused the tape, not sure I was ready to see what came next, but I forced myself to continue. The figures removed their clothing with the same synchronised precision they'd shown in every other recording. Underneath their suits, their bodies were pale, almost luminescent in the afternoon light, too thin, with limbs that seemed slightly too long for their torsos. They walked into the water without hesitation, continuing until they were completely submerged. The reservoir surface showed no ripples, no disturbance of any kind. Henry's camera remained fixed on the water for the next 20 minutes of tape. Nothing happened. No bubbles, no movement, nothing to suggest that two people had just walked into the depths of a 40-foot deep reservoir. Then, at the 23-minute mark, they emerged. But they didn't surface like drowning victims or swimmers coming up for air. They simply appeared at the water's edge, as if they had materialised there. Completely dry. They dressed with the same mechanical precision and returned to their vehicle. As the black sedan drove away, Henry's whispered narration resumed. I don't think they're human. The tape ended there. I sat in Henry's basement for a long time after that, staring at the static-filled screen and trying to process what I'd just seen. Every rational explanation I could think of fell apart under scrutiny. Special effects didn't exist in 1996 that could create that kind of footage, especially not for an amateur filmmaker using a home video camera. I looked around at the hundreds of remaining tapes and realised I'd barely scratched the surface of Henry's documentation. How much more evidence was stored in this basement? How many more incidents had he recorded over nearly 5 decades? But more importantly, if these figures weren't human, what were they? And why had they been systematically suppressing reports of unexplained phenomena in Millfield County for almost 50 years? I selected 3 more tapes at random and settled in to continue watching. Outside, afternoon was fading into evening, but I barely noticed. I was beginning to understand why Henry had covered all his windows with blackout curtains. Some things were better observed from the shadows. The next tape, dated April 7th, 2001, showed the 2 figures visiting an elderly woman at her farmhouse outside town. She had reported seeing lights in formation, moving across her property for 3 consecutive nights. The footage was clearer than the earlier recordings. Henry had upgraded his equipment by then. I watched the figures approach the woman's front door with their characteristic synchronised movement. She answered their knock, spoke with them for approximately 15 minutes, then nodded several times before closing the door. 3 days later, according to Henry's notes, she died of a heart attack. Natural causes, the coroner had ruled. No signs of violence or foul play. But watching the tape, I noticed something chilling about the encounter. During the entire 15-minute conversation, the woman never looked directly at either of the figures. Her eyes remained fixed on a point somewhere between them, as if she was physically unable to make direct eye contact. The 4th tape was even more disturbing. December 23rd, 2003 showed the interior of what I recognised as the Millfield Diner, the same location where Eddie Morrison had been approached 16 years earlier. But this time, the camera was positioned inside the restaurant, apparently hidden among the decorations or equipment. The timestamp showed 11:47 p.m. The diner was nearly empty, just a waitress behind the counter, a cook visible through the kitchen window, and one customer seated at a booth near the back. The customer was a young man, maybe early 20s, wearing a Millfield Community College sweatshirt. He was working on what looked like homework while eating a piece of pie. At 11:52, the two figures entered the diner. They moved to the young man's booth and slid into the seat across from him. Unlike their usual approach to witnesses in parking lots or outside homes, this encounter was happening in public, in front of witnesses. But the waitress and cook continued their work as if nothing unusual was happening. They didn't even glance in the direction of the booth where three people were now engaged in what appeared to be an intense conversation. The young man's body language progressed through the same stages I'd seen in other encounters. Initial confusion, growing alarm, then fearful compliance. After approximately 10 minutes, he gathered his books and left the diner with the two figures. The waitress and cook never looked up. It was as if the encounter had been completely invisible to everyone except the target and whoever was operating Henry's hidden camera. I rewound the tape and watched it again, focusing on the background. The waitress moved through her routine, wiping down counters, refilling coffee, checking orders, but her movements had a mechanical quality that reminded me of the figures themselves. The cook was equally robotic, flipping burgers and cleaning the grill with precise, repetitive motions. Neither of them had blinked during the entire encounter. The fifth and final tape I watched that day was dated August 14th, 2004, the most recent in Henry's collection, before the long gap leading up to his final recording in 2025. This one showed Henry himself. The camera was positioned to show a mirror, reflecting Henry as he sat at his kitchen table in the middle of the night. He looked younger than when I'd found his body, but already showed signs of the stress that would consume the final decades of his life. August 14th, 2004, he said to his reflection. I think I understand now what they are and why they're here. He held up a manila folder thick with documents and photographs. It took me 26 years to piece it together, but I finally have enough evidence to prove what's been happening in Millfield County. These aren't government agents. They aren't human at all. Henry opened the folder and spread its contents across the table. Even in the mirror's reflection, I could see newspaper clippings, photographs, and what looked like official documents. They're some kind of watchers. Guardians, maybe. Their job is to maintain the cover-up, to make sure that certain kinds of information never become public knowledge. They've been doing it for decades. Maybe longer. He picked up one of the photographs and held it toward the mirror. It showed the reservoir, but from an angle I didn't recognise. The water was different, clearer, with something visible beneath the surface. The reservoir isn't natural, Henry continued. It was built in 1962 over an existing site. Government records show geological anomalies in the area dating back to the 1940s. Military interest in the region, classified research projects. He set down the photograph and picked up what looked like a government document with heavy black redactions. I think they're guarding something that was discovered here decades ago, something the public can't be allowed to know about. And these two entities, they're part of whatever was found. Henry's reflection looked directly into the camera and I saw genuine terror in his eyes. I'm going to hide this evidence tomorrow. If something happens to me, if they finally decide I know too much, maybe someone will eventually piece together the truth. The tape ended with Henry beginning to repack the folder. I sat in the basement until well after dark, surrounded by decades of documentation that painted a picture so far outside normal reality that I could barely process it. But the evidence was overwhelming, consistent, methodical. Whatever Henry Mallory had discovered, he'd spent the rest of his life documenting it, with the dedication of a true believer and the precision of a trained investigator. And now, 21 years later, someone had found his final message. As I packed up the tapes I'd watched and prepared to leave the basement, I noticed something I'd missed earlier. One section of shelving was completely empty, a gap where perhaps a dozen tapes should have been stored. According to the labels on either side of the empty space, the missing tapes covered the period from 2005 to 2025. 20 years of documentation, gone. But gone where? And when? I had a terrible suspicion that I already knew the answer. I found the final tape 3 days later, not in the basement archive, but sitting on Henry's kitchen counter, where I was certain it hadn't been before. I'd been returning to the house every day, ostensibly to complete the estate inventory, but really to continue reviewing Henry's documentation. Each time I entered, I made a mental note of how everything was positioned, a habit that had developed from 3 years of conducting welfare checks in homes where details mattered. The tape sat next to the coffee maker, labelled in Henry's familiar handwriting, October 25th, 2025, final entry, 2 days before I'd found his body. My hands shook as I carried it down to the basement and slid it into the VHS player. The footage began immediately, showing Henry in his living room, looking directly into the camera. Behind him, every window was covered with the blackout curtains, creating a cave-like atmosphere even in what appeared to be daylight. October 25th, 2025, Henry began, his voice steady but carrying an undertone of exhaustion. This will be my final recording. They're done waiting. He gestured toward the curtained windows. They've been outside for 6 days now. Not just at night anymore. Constant surveillance. 2 shifts, different vehicles, but always the same entities. The camera angle shifted, showing Henry's view through a gap in the curtains. A black sedan sat across the street, 2 familiar figures standing beside it in the bright afternoon sun. But now there was also a dark SUV parked at the corner, with 2 more figures visible near it. 4 of them now, Henry continued. In 47 years of watching, I've never seen more than 2 at a time. Something's changed. He moved back to his chair and I could see the stress of decades etched into his face. But there was also something else, a kind of resigned determination. I need to tell you about 1977, he said, the year before I started filming. The year everything began. Henry reached for a manila folder, the same one I'd seen in his 2004 recording. July 19th, 1977. I was working construction on the new water treatment facility. Standard job, nothing unusual about it. But we were digging foundation trenches near the old reservoir when we hit something that wasn't on any of the geological surveys. He opened the folder and pulled out a black and white photograph that he held toward the camera. It showed what looked like an excavation site, with several men in hard hats standing around a deep trench. Metal, Henry said, but not like any metal we'd ever seen. Dark, almost black, with a surface that seemed to absorb light instead of reflecting it. The shape was geometric, perfect angles, mathematical precision, obviously artificial. He set down the photograph and picked up what appeared to be an official document. Foreman called the county engineer called the state called someone in Washington. By the next morning, we had federal agents on site telling us the excavation was being classified under national security. Henry's voice grew bitter. They told us we'd been digging near an old military testing site. Unexploded ordnance, they said. Dangerous to continue. We were all sworn to secrecy, paid double our contracted rate, and told to find work elsewhere. He pulled out another photograph, this one showing the excavation site after it had been backfilled and covered with concrete. But I was curious. Started asking questions around town about the old military testing. Problem was, nobody knew anything about any military activity in the area. No records at the county office. No stories from old-timers who would have remembered. It was like the whole story had been fabricated. The camera angle shifted again, showing Henry's view of the street. The figures outside hadn't moved, but somehow they seemed closer than before. That's when I started paying attention to things that didn't quite fit. Strange lights, people reported, but that never made it into the newspaper. Witnesses who suddenly left town after talking to authorities. A pattern of suppression that had been going on for years before I noticed it. Henry turned back to the camera and I could see genuine fear in his eyes now. The thing is, I don't think they found what was buried that day. I think what was buried found them. He reached into the folder one more time and pulled out a document I hadn't seen before. A map of Millfield County with several locations marked in red ink. I've been tracking the incidents for 47 years, and they all centre around specific geographic points. The reservoir, obviously, but also the old grain elevator on Route 9, the abandoned mining complex east of town and the county landfill. Henry traced the marked locations with his finger. All of these sites show the same pattern of witness suppression. All of them have underground components, basement levels, mining tunnels, deep excavations, and all of them are connected by what the geological surveys call natural aquifer systems. He looked directly into the camera. I don't think they're natural at all. I think they're part of something larger, something that's been under Millfield County for a very long time. The tape jumped forward several hours. The timestamp now showed 11:47 p.m, and Henry looked exhausted. "They're moving," he said simply. Through the gap in the curtains, I could see both vehicles had repositioned themselves. The black sedan was now directly in front of Henry's house, while the SUV had moved to the back alley. The four figures had formed a perimeter around the property. "I found something yesterday," Henry continued, "in the basement of the old grain elevator. Been exploring these sites for years, but this was different. There's a chamber down there, filled with the same black metal we found in 1977. He held up a small object, roughly cylindrical, about the size of a flashlight, made of the same light-absorbing material he had described. But this was sitting on a table in the centre of the chamber, like someone left it there for me to find. Henry turned the object in his hands, and I could see symbols etched into its surface, geometric patterns that seemed to shift and move in the camera's light. When I touched it, I saw things, understood things. This isn't just about covering up UFO sightings or maintaining some government secret. This is about keeping something contained, something that's been trying to communicate with the surface world for decades. The object began to emit a faint glow, barely visible in the dim lighting of Henry's living room. The entities outside, they're not aliens or government agents, they're guardians. Part of a containment system that's been in place since whatever's down there was first discovered. And the people who report sightings, who get too close to the truth, they're not just being silenced. Henry's voice dropped to a whisper. They're being recruited. The glow from the object intensified, and Henry set it carefully on the table beside his chair. I understand now why the witnesses leave town, where they go, what they become. The sightings aren't random events. They're calls for help. Communications from something that's been trapped underground for God knows how long. Outside, the four figures had begun moving toward the house. "And now it's my turn," Henry said, standing up from his chair. "I've learned too much, documented too much. But maybe that was always the plan. Maybe someone was supposed to find the evidence eventually." The camera remained fixed on Henry as he moved toward his front door. Through the curtained windows, I could see flashlight beams moving across the walls. "If you're watching this, you have a choice," Henry said, his hand on the doorknob. "You can try to expose what I've discovered, publish the tapes, contact the media, get the truth out there. But they'll find you, just like they found me." The flashlight beams were getting brighter, and I could hear the sound of footsteps on Henry's front porch. Or you can do what I should have done 47 years ago. Walk away, forget what you've seen. Let the containment system do its job. Henry opened the door. The tape went to static. I sat in the basement for a long time after the recording ended, staring at the dead screen and trying to process what I'd just witnessed. According to the timestamp, this footage had been recorded less than 48 hours before I'd found Henry's body in his living room. But the coroner had ruled it natural causes, heart failure, no signs of violence or struggle. I rewound the tape and watched the final moments again, looking for details I'd missed. When Henry opened the door, there was a brief glimpse of the figures outside, tall, pale, wearing their characteristic dark suits. But in that instant before the tape cut to static, I caught something I hadn't noticed before. They weren't alone. Behind them, barely visible in the darkness, stood other figures, dozens of them, forming a crowd that stretched beyond the range of the camera. Men and women of various ages, all wearing the same dark clothing, all standing with the same rigid posture I'd seen in Henry's surveillance footage. Eddie Morrison was among them. I was certain of it, even though the footage was too brief and dark to make out specific faces. The same build, the same work clothes I'd seen in the 1987 diner footage. How many witnesses had been recruited over the decades? How many missing persons cases could be explained by whatever process Henry had discovered? And now they had come for him. Why leave his body to be found? Why not make Henry disappear like all the others? The answer came to me as I ejected the tape and looked around at Henry's massive archive. They wanted someone to find the evidence. 47 years of documentation, carefully preserved and organised, waiting for the right person to discover it. Someone like me. I turned off the basement lights and climbed the stairs, the final tape clutched in my hand. At the top I paused and looked back down into the darkness. Henry had spent nearly half a century documenting a containment system designed to suppress knowledge of something buried beneath Millfield County. Something that communicated through unexplained phenomena trying to reach the surface world, and now I had become part of that system. The question was, what was I going to do about it? I started asking questions the next day, against every instinct screaming at me to walk away, to forget everything I'd seen in Henry's basement. I began reaching out to people who might have known him. I told myself I was just being thorough, completing the welfare check investigation properly. The truth was, I couldn't stop thinking about that crowd of figures standing behind the two guardians at Henry's door. All those missing witnesses recruited into whatever system had been containing the thing beneath Millfield County. My first stop was Mrs. Henderson, the neighbour who had provided Henry's spare key location. She was in her 70s, a retired schoolteacher who had lived on Maple Street for most of her adult life. "Poor Henry," she said, serving me coffee in her immaculate kitchen. "Always seemed like such a troubled man. Paranoid, you know. Always peeking through those awful curtains, writing in those notebooks. Did he ever talk to you about what he was documenting?" Mrs. Henderson pursed her lips. "Oh, he tried to, especially in the early years, going on about government conspiracies and mysterious visitors. I told him he was watching too much television." "What kind of mysterious visitors?" "Men in suits," he claimed. Said they were watching him, intimidating people who reported strange things. Nonsense, of course. This is Millfield County. Nothing mysterious ever happens here. But as she spoke, I noticed her hands trembling slightly as she poured the coffee. And when I asked if she'd ever seen any unusual activity around Henry's house, her answer came too quickly. "Nothing at all. Very quiet neighbourhood. I mind my own business." I left her house with the distinct impression that Mrs. Henderson knew more than she was willing to admit. But whether that was from fear or something else, I couldn't tell. My next stop was the Millfield Gazette, where I hoped to find archives of the UFO reports Henry had referenced in his documentation. The current editor, a young woman named Lisa Parker, was helpful but puzzled. "We don't really cover that kind of story anymore," she said, scrolling through digital archives on her computer. "Liability issues, you know. People make wild claims, we print them, then they sue us when nothing comes of it. What about historical reports? Say from the 1980s or 1990s. Lisa frowned at her screen. "That's strange. We should have digital copies of everything from 1975 forward, but there are gaps, whole weeks missing from some years." She pulled up what appeared to be a filing system showing years and months. Large sections were greyed out, marked as archived or unavailable. "I've never noticed this before," she muttered. "Let me check the physical archives." 20 minutes later, she returned from the basement storage area looking confused. "This doesn't make sense. We have boxes for every year, but some of them are nearly empty, like someone went through and removed specific issues." "Which years?" Lisa consulted her notes. "Scattered throughout the 80s and 90s, and," she paused, checking again, 2001, 2003, 2004. Almost nothing from those years. The same years when Henry's documentation showed increased activity from the Guardians. I thanked Lisa and left the newspaper office, but I could feel her watching me through the front window as I walked to my car. In the reflection of the glass, I caught a glimpse of someone else watching from across the street. A tall figure in a dark suit standing perfectly still beside a black sedan. My heart rate spiked, but when I turned for a direct look, the street was empty. That afternoon, I drove to the Millfield Diner and spoke with the evening manager, an older man named Carl who had worked there for over 20 years. I asked about Eddie Morrison, the maintenance worker from Henry's 1987 footage. "Eddie Morrison," Carl repeated, scratching his head. "Name sounds familiar, but I can't place him. You sure he worked around here?" "He was a regular customer, apparently. Used to come in late at night." Carl's expression changed slightly. "Oh, you mean late shift, Eddie?" Yeah, I remember him now. Quiet guy, kept to himself, stopped coming around suddenly. Must have been the late 80s or early 90s. Do you know what happened to him? Moved away, I think. People do that sometimes. Get tired of small-town life, head for the city. But Carl avoided eye contact as he spoke, and his voice carried the same forced casualness I'd heard from Mrs. Henderson. I ordered coffee and sat in the same booth where I'd seen Eddie Morrison confronted by the Guardians. The diner felt normal. Typical small-town restaurant with checkered floors and outdated decor. But I found myself studying the other customers, looking for signs of the mechanical behaviour I'd seen in Henry's footage. Nothing seemed unusual until I got up to leave. As I paid my bill, I noticed Carl watching me with an intensity that seemed out of proportion to a simple customer interaction. When our eyes met, he looked away quickly, but not before I caught something in his expression that looked like recognition, like he knew exactly why I was asking questions about Eddie Morrison. I drove home as the sun was setting, checking my rearview mirror constantly for black sedans. The streets of Millfield seemed normal. Light traffic, people heading home from work, kids playing in front yards. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. That feeling intensified when I pulled into my driveway. Sitting on my front porch was a manila envelope with my name written on it in block letters. No postmark, no return address. Someone had delivered it by hand. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a typed message. Stop asking questions about Henry Mallory. Some knowledge is dangerous. This is your only warning. Below the text was a photograph, a black and white image showing me leaving the newspaper office that afternoon. In the background, barely visible in the shadow of a building, stood two tall figures in dark suits. I went inside and deadbolted the door, then checked every window to make sure they were locked. The rational part of my mind insisted that this was just someone playing an elaborate prank, perhaps inspired by Henry's well-known paranoia. But the photograph was real, and the timing, delivered within hours of my investigation, suggested a level of surveillance that went far beyond anything a prankster could manage. I made dinner but couldn't eat it. Every sound outside made me jump. Cars passing, neighbours talking, the wind moving through the trees, normal suburban noises that suddenly felt threatening. Around 10 p.m, I turned off all the lights and peered through my living room curtains at the street outside. A black sedan was parked across from my house. Two figures stood beside it, perfectly still facing my front door. In the dim light from the street lamp, I could make out their characteristic tall, thin builds and dark suits. They weren't trying to hide their presence. If anything, they seemed to want me to see them. I watched for an hour and they never moved, never spoke to each other, never showed any of the restless behaviours that normal surveillance teams would display during a long watch. At 11:15, I decided to test them. I turned on my porch light and stepped outside, making no attempt at stealth. If they were watching me, they would know I was coming. The moment I appeared on my porch, both figures turned their heads toward me with mechanical precision. Even from across the street I could see their pale faces and dark eyes. They stood perfectly aligned, like mirror images of each other. "Can I help you?" I called out, surprised by how steady my voice sounded. They didn't respond, didn't move, just stood there watching me with a kind of absolute stillness that no living person could maintain. I took a step toward the street, and they both took a step backward, maintaining the exact same distance between us. Another step forward, another synchronized step back. It was like some kind of bizarre dance, with invisible rules that kept us in perfect equilibrium. "What do you want?" I shouted. This time one of them, impossible to tell which in the poor lighting, spoke. The voice carried clearly across the distance, but it had an odd quality. Too precise, like someone reading from a script. "Return to your house. Discontinue your investigation. This is your final warning." The words were completely clear, but something about them felt wrong. The cadence was off, as if the speaker was mimicking human speech without fully understanding its natural rhythm. What happened to Henry Mallory? Mr. Mallory chose to join the containment protocol. The same choice is available to you. What containment protocol? What are you containing? But instead of answering, both figures turned away from me and got into their vehicle. The car pulled away from the curb and disappeared down the street without making a sound. No engine noise, just like Henry had described in his recordings. I stood on my porch for several more minutes, staring at the empty street and trying to process what had just happened. The conversation, if it could be called that, had felt completely surreal. Like talking to sophisticated automatons that had been programmed with just enough human behaviour to maintain a conversation, but not enough to seem genuinely alive. Back inside, I double-checked all my locks and closed every curtain. Then I sat in my living room with the lights off, thinking about what the figure had said. Mr. Mallory chose to join the containment protocol. Not that he had died. Not that he had been eliminated for knowing too much. That he had chosen to join something, and the same choice was available to me. I thought about that crowd of figures I'd seen in Henry's final recording. All those missing witnesses standing behind the Guardians like a silent army. Had they all made the same choice? And if so, what exactly were they containing? Outside, the street remained quiet, but I had the distinct feeling that this was far from over. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I sat in my darkened living room, periodically checking the windows for any sign of the black sedan's return. Around 3 a.m, I made a decision that would have seemed insane just a week earlier. I was going to document everything just like Henry had. If something happened to me, if I chose to join the containment protocol or simply disappeared like so many witnesses before me, at least there would be a record. I set up my smartphone to record and positioned it on the coffee table, where it could capture both me and the view out my front window. Then I began to tell my story, starting with the welfare check that had led me to Henry Mallory's basement archive. I talked for 2 hours, describing everything I'd seen in his recordings, the pattern of witness intimidation, the strange behaviour of the Guardians, and my own growing certainty that something had been hidden beneath Millfield County for decades. When I finished, I uploaded the video to 3 different cloud storage services and emailed copies to friends in other states. If the Guardians could scrub newspaper archives and make entire video channels disappear overnight, I wanted to make sure this record would be harder to erase. The next morning, I drove to the one location Henry had mentioned that I hadn't yet visited, the old grain elevator on Route 9. The structure had been abandoned for at least 20 years, a massive concrete tower surrounded by rusted storage silos and overgrown with weeds. A chain-link fence topped with barbed wire surrounded the property, but age and weather had created several gaps large enough to slip through. I parked a half-mile away and approached on foot, carrying a flashlight and the smartphone I'd used for my recording the night before. If Henry had found something in the basement of this building, I needed to see it for myself. The main elevator building was 4 stories tall, with broken windows and graffiti covering most of the accessible surfaces. But what I was looking for would be underground, in the basement levels that Henry had mentioned. I found a service entrance on the north side of the building that had been secured with a padlock very similar to the one on Henry's basement door. The lock was old and rusted, and it gave way after several minutes of work with a crowbar I'd brought from my car. The door opened onto a concrete stairwell that descended into absolute darkness. My flashlight beam revealed steps leading down at least 2 levels, with water-stained walls and the musty smell of long abandonment. The first basement level was what I'd expected. Old machinery, storage rooms filled with obsolete equipment, the normal detritus of an industrial facility that had been shut down decades ago. But at the far end of the main corridor I found another stairwell leading deeper underground. This second basement was different. The walls were made of the same black metal Henry had described from the 1977 excavation. Smooth, geometrically precise surfaces that seemed to absorb my flashlight beam rather than reflect it. The corridor extended in both directions beyond the range of my light, but I could see doorways at regular intervals. I chose the left corridor and began exploring. The first door I came to was standing open, revealing a circular chamber about 20 feet in diameter. The walls, floor and ceiling were all made of the same light-absorbing material, covered with intricate geometric patterns that seemed to shift and move in my flashlight beam. In the centre of the room sat a table, or what I assumed was a table. It was integrated into the floor, rising from the black metal surface like it had been grown rather than built. On top of it lay several objects similar to the cylindrical device Henry had shown in his final recording. I approached carefully, recording everything with my phone. The objects were warm to the touch, despite the cold temperature of the underground chamber. As I picked up one of them, symbols began to appear on its surface, the same geometric patterns that covered the walls. Then I heard voices, human voices coming from deeper in the corridor. Multiple people engaged in what sounded like a conversation, though I couldn't make out words from this distance. I turned off my flashlight and followed the sound, using my phone screen to provide just enough illumination to avoid walking into walls. The voices grew clearer as I approached, and I began to recognise what I was hearing. It was Henry's voice, along with others I didn't recognise, all speaking in the same measured, precise cadence I'd heard from the guardian outside my house the night before. The corridor ended in a much larger chamber, this one filled with what looked like workstations. Dozens of people sat at tables similar to the one I'd found in the smaller room, all handling the cylindrical objects, all speaking in those same careful, scripted voices. I recognised several faces from Henry's documentation. Eddie Morrison was there, looking exactly as he had in the 1987 diner footage, despite nearly 40 years having passed. The young college student from the 2003 recording sat at a nearby table, also unchanged by time, and at the centre of the chamber, directing the activities with quiet authority, was Henry Mallory. He looked up from his work as I entered the chamber, and our eyes met across the room. For a moment his expression showed a flicker of the man I'd seen in the basement recordings. Frightened, desperate, human. Then it shifted to the same blank efficiency I'd observed in all the others. "Jamie," he said, his voice carrying that odd precision, "we've been expecting you." I took an involuntary step backward, but found my path blocked by two familiar figures. The guardians from my front porch stood behind me, their pale faces showing no emotion. "You have questions," Henry continued, standing up from his workstation. "That's natural. I had questions too when I first discovered this place." "What is this?" I managed to ask. "What are you doing down here?" "We're maintaining the containment," Henry said, gesturing around the chamber, "preventing the surface world from learning about what lies beneath. It's important work. Necessary work." "You're dead," I said. "I found your body. The coroner ruled it natural causes." Henry smiled, but it was wrong somehow. Too wide, too controlled. "Death is just another transition. Another form of service. We who have learned too much, who have seen too much, we're given the opportunity to become part of the solution instead of part of the problem." Around the chamber, the other workers continued their activities with mechanical precision. No one looked up from their tasks. No one showed any curiosity about my presence or the conversation taking place. "The objects we work with," Henry continued, picking up one of the cylindrical devices, "they're communication tools, translators. They allow us to interface with the entity that has been contained here since 1962. "What entity?" "Something that fell from the sky in 1947. Something that the government tried to study and couldn't understand. They built the reservoir over the crash site, thinking they could contain it with water and concrete. But it continued to communicate, continued to try to reach the surface world." Henry held up the device, and symbols began appearing on its surface. Every UFO sighting, every unexplained phenomenon reported in this county, their attempts at communication, messages trying to reach someone who could understand, and every time someone got too close to the truth, the containment protocol was activated. "So you silence them, make them disappear." "We recruit them," Henry corrected. "We give them the opportunity to understand, to become part of something larger than themselves." Around the chamber I could see dozens of workstations, each occupied by someone who had supposedly disappeared over the past several decades, all working with the same focused determination, all speaking in the same precise cadence. "What's it like?" I asked. "Being part of this containment protocol?" Henry's expression flickered again, and for just a moment I saw genuine emotion there. Fear, sadness, regret. "It's peaceful," he said, but his voice wavered slightly. "No more questions, no more uncertainty, just purpose." But as he spoke, I noticed something that chilled me more than anything I'd seen so far. Tears were running down Henry's face, even as he smiled and spoke about peace and purpose. The containment protocol hadn't just recruited him, it had trapped him. All of them. "I don't want to join," I said. "That's what I said," Henry replied, "but you will, eventually. The alternative is much worse." The two guardians stepped closer and I felt their cold hands on my shoulders, but instead of forcing me toward one of the workstations, they simply stood there, waiting. "The choice is yours," Henry said. "Join the containment protocol willingly and maintain some small part of who you were. Resist and become something else entirely." I looked around the chamber at all the missing witnesses, all the people who had supposedly chosen to join this underground operation. None of them looked up. None of them showed any sign of individual will or personality. But Henry's tears told a different story. "There's a third option," I said, "which is, I leave. I walk out of here. I never speak of what I've seen." Henry shook his head. "Too late for that. You've seen too much, learned too much. The containment protocol cannot allow that knowledge to exist outside our control." But even as he spoke, I could see doubt in his eyes, and I realized something that might be important. "You want me to choose the third option," I said. "You're hoping I'll find a way out that you couldn't." Henry's smile faltered completely. "Don't," he whispered. "Don't give them any reason to doubt your compliance." But it was too late. The guardians had heard, and their grip on my shoulders tightened. As they began to guide me toward an empty workstation, I made my own choice. I ran. I made it as far as the first basement level before they caught me. The guardians moved with inhuman speed, their footsteps completely silent on the concrete floors. When they grabbed me again, their hands were no longer cold. They burned like ice, and I could feel something changing in my body wherever they touched. They dragged me back to the chamber where Henry and the others continued their work, seemingly oblivious to my attempted escape. But as the guardians forced me into a chair at an empty workstation, Henry looked up from his own work and met my eyes. "I'm sorry," he said, and this time his voice sounded completely human. "I tried to warn you." One of the guardians placed a cylindrical device in my hands. The moment my fingers closed around it, symbols began appearing on its surface, and I heard something that wasn't quite a voice speaking directly into my mind. "Welcome," it said. "We have been waiting for you." Images flooded my consciousness. The thing that had crashed in 1947, the government's attempts to study and contain it, the decades of communication attempts that had been systematically suppressed. I saw the truth of what the containment protocol really was. Not protection of the surface world from an alien entity. Protection of the entity from the surface world. The thing beneath Millfield County wasn't trying to escape or invade. It was dying, slowly, from decades of isolation and containment. The UFO sightings, the unexplained phenomena, they were distress calls from a being that was trapped as surely as any of the human workers in this underground chamber. The Guardians weren't protecting humanity from an alien threat. They were protecting a government cover-up that had lasted over 70 years. "Help us," the voice continued, "help us return home." And suddenly I understood what my real choice was. I could join the containment protocol, become another worker in this underground facility, and spend whatever remained of my existence helping to maintain a lie that served no one. Or I could help the entity do what it had been trying to do for decades, communicate with the outside world. I looked around the chamber at all the people who had been recruited over the years. Henry, Eddie Morrison, the college student, dozens of others, all of them working with mechanical precision to maintain the containment. But as I watched more carefully, I noticed something the Guardians had missed. Subtle glances between the workers, hand signals passed when the Guardians weren't looking. Micro expressions that suggested more awareness than they were supposed to have. The containment protocol wasn't perfect. Some part of these people's original personalities remained, buried beneath the compulsion to serve but not entirely destroyed, including Henry. When our eyes met again, he gave an almost imperceptible nod towards something behind me. I glanced back without moving my head and saw what he was indicating, a communication panel built into the wall connected to the surface world. The entity's voice continued in my mind, showing me images of its home, its people, the desperate need to re-establish contact with those who had sent it to Earth decades ago. They told your people we were invaders. We were explorers, scientists. Peaceful contact was always our intention. I made my decision. Instead of accepting the role of containment worker, I reached for the communication panel. The moment my hand touched the controls, alarms began blaring throughout the chamber. The Guardians moved toward me with their inhuman speed, but the other workers suddenly rose from their stations. For the first time since I'd entered this underground facility, they acted like human beings instead of automatons. Eddie Morrison tackled one Guardian while the college student disabled another. Henry himself moved to help me with the communication equipment. "Hurry," he said, his voice urgent and completely human now. "The compulsion is strong. We can't fight it for long." I input the emergency broadcast codes I'd learned during my county training, patching the chamber's communication system into every radio and television frequency in the area. Then I stepped back and let the entity speak for itself. The broadcast lasted exactly 17 minutes. 17 minutes of first contact, broadcast live across 3 counties. The entity's voice translated through the cylindrical devices, speaking directly to anyone who was listening, explaining its peaceful intentions, its decades of imprisonment, its desperate need to return home. The Guardians eventually overcame the resistance of the recruited workers and shut down the broadcast, but it was too late. The truth was out there, recorded on hundreds of devices, witnessed by thousands of people. For the first time in over 70 years, the containment protocol had failed. The aftermath was swift and brutal. Within hours, the entire underground facility was evacuated by federal agents. The recruited workers, including Henry, were transferred to undisclosed locations. The grain elevator was demolished and the site covered with concrete. Official sources claimed the broadcast had been an elaborate hoax, possibly connected to terrorist activity. Anyone who tried to share recordings found their files corrupted or their accounts suspended. The story disappeared from news coverage within 48 hours, but not completely. I escaped during the evacuation, slipping away while the agents were focused on securing the facility and transporting the workers. I had 17 minutes of audio from the entity's broadcast saved on my phone, and copies hidden in cloud storage accounts the authorities hadn't yet discovered. More importantly, I had the truth. The entity had provided coordinates for its homeworld, mathematical proofs of its peaceful intentions, and detailed information about technologies that could revolutionize human understanding of physics and space travel. All of it suppressed by a containment protocol that served no one except the people who had built their careers on maintaining a 70-year-old lie. I tried to release the information through traditional channels, news outlets, scientific journals, government representatives. Every attempt was blocked, censored, or discredited before it could gain traction. But the internet is a harder thing to control completely. Anonymous accounts, encrypted files, peer-to-peer networks that existed outside government oversight. Slowly, carefully, I began sharing fragments of the truth. Not all at once. That would have been too easy to dismiss as fraud. But piece by piece, building a pattern that people could discover for themselves. UFO enthusiasts found the audio recordings. Scientists encountered the mathematical proofs. Government transparency advocates uncovered documents related to the 1947 crash and subsequent cover-up. Each piece of evidence was authentic, verifiable, impossible to completely suppress. 3 months after the failed containment protocol, a new pattern began emerging. Instead of isolated sightings that could be dismissed or intimidated into silence, coordinated contact events started occurring worldwide. The entity I'd helped contact had shared Earth's location and situation with its people. First contact wasn't a single event. It was an ongoing process that no government could control or contain. I still live in Millfield County, though I've moved to a different house on the other side of town. Sometimes I see black sedans in my neighbourhood, and occasionally I notice figures in dark suits watching me from a distance. But they don't approach anymore. The containment protocol is broken, and trying to silence individual witnesses is pointless when the truth has taken on a life of its own. Last week I received a package with no return address. Inside was a VHS tape labelled simply, "Thank you." The footage showed Henry Mallory sitting in what appeared to be a comfortable room with large windows overlooking a garden. He looked peaceful, genuinely relaxed for the first time in any recording I'd seen. Behind him, I could see other people I recognised from the underground chamber. Eddie Morrison, the college student, all the recruited witnesses. They were free. The entity kept its promise, Henry said to the camera. When contact was re-established with its people, they came for all of us. We're being taken home, not to their world, but to a place where we can live without the compulsion, without the containment protocol controlling our minds. He smiled, and this time it reached his eyes. You did the right thing, Jamie. The truth was worth the risk. It's always worth the risk. The tape ended with a view of the garden where former witnesses walked freely, talking and laughing like human beings instead of automatons. I keep that tape in a safe place, along with copies of all the evidence I've managed to preserve. Not because I think anyone will try to take it from me, the time for that kind of suppression has passed, but because it reminds me that even the most carefully constructed lies eventually fall apart when confronted with enough truth. The entity and its people are still here, working openly with human scientists and governments to establish formal diplomatic relations. The technology they've shared has already begun revolutionizing our understanding of physics, medicine, and space travel. And somewhere in the files of a dozen different agencies, there are records of the people who spent 70 years maintaining a containment protocol that served no purpose except to protect the careers of those who had created it. Henry Mallory was right about one thing. They never do leave you alone once you've learned too much. But sometimes, if you're very careful and very lucky, you can make sure the truth survives long enough to set everyone free, including yourself. The blackout curtains are gone from my windows now. I sleep with the lights off and the doors unlocked. The shadows no longer hide watchers, and the silence is just silence. But every night before I go to bed, I look up at the stars and remember that we're not alone anymore. And that's a truth worth any price.